Over 500 years ago, humanity began a quiet experiment, replacing faith with control, punishment with order, and freedom with surveillance. It's a story you were never told in school, one where pain became procedure and obedience became progress. If your history class ever made you sleepy, this one's meant to. When people today imagine the Middle Ages, they often picture banners, knights, and cathedrals rising against a pale sky. But for most who lived through these centuries, life was much smaller. It was a circle of mud roads, wooden houses, and familiar faces that grew old far too quickly. A world of cold mornings, of smoke from damp fires, of bells echoing over fields still heavy with dew. In that small world, order mattered more than freedom. Without order, life could slip into hunger or chaos in a single season. So every village, no matter how poor, clung to a system, half custom, half superstition, that promised stability. And punishment, when it came, was simply another way to hold the world in place. There was no single law that covered all of Europe. Rules changed from valley to valley. One lord might demand a fine of grain for theft, another might order the culprit's ear cut off. Yet behind these differences lay the same thought. Someone must pay, or the balance will break. Fear was constant but strangely familiar. It sat beside people like the weather, unwelcome but expected. A farmer feared drought more than sin, but he also feared what a priest might call divine anger. A merchant feared bandits on the road, but he also feared the gossip that could ruin his name. And in that mixture of worldly and sacred dread, punishment became both warning and comfort. To be punished was terrible, but it meant the story was not yet over. A sin or crime acknowledged, a pain endured, might still restore peace. To escape punishment entirely, to be unaccounted for, was worse. It meant the scales had not yet balanced. Something, somewhere, would have to give. Most villages had no courtroom. Justice unfolded wherever people already gathered, in taverns, under oak trees, on the church steps after Sunday Mass. A local reeve or steward would hear complaints, surrounded by neighbours who nodded or shook their heads. There were few written records. Memory and rumour did the work of evidence. Sometimes justice looked like conversation, loud, chaotic, everyone talking at once. Other times it was quiet, a single order given, a man led away. People did not expect fairness in the modern sense. They hoped only for predictability. They wanted to know what would happen, and for that tradition was enough. The punishments themselves were physical, visible, and memorable. The pillory stood in many market squares, 2 hinged boards with holes for the neck and hands. It faced the crowd deliberately. Punishment was not meant to be hidden, it was meant to be seen, absorbed, remembered. Villagers passed by, some mocking, some silent, children peering from behind parents' legs. When the day ended, the offender was released, bruised and humiliated but alive. The crowd returned home feeling that justice, however crude, had been done. A fine served a similar purpose, though quieter. Coins or grain changed hands, the Lord's reeve wrote a note or simply nodded, and balance was restored. In poor communities, fines were dangerous. They could drive a family toward starvation. Yet they were preferred to blood, because a fine could be measured and ended, while revenge could last for generations. For serious crimes, punishment carried the weight of ceremony. The gallows was built at the edge of town, often on a small hill so travellers would see it from afar. It warned newcomers before they entered, "This place keeps order." Executions were rare enough to draw crowds. Farmers walked miles to witness them, partly out of fear, partly out of curiosity. There was talk of morality, of justice, of sin, but there was also, quietly, the thrill of spectacle. Religion moved through all this not as constant preaching but as atmosphere. It shaped the way people interpreted events. A good harvest meant God was pleased. A bad one meant someone somewhere had angered him. But even those who seldom prayed still lived under rhythms set by faith. The church bell marked time, morning work, midday rest, evening prayer. It also marked punishment. When the bell rang out of sequence, villagers paused. Someone was being judged. The church offered more than sermons. It offered legitimacy. If a lord punished without moral backing, he risked rebellion. If a priest punished without local support, he risked irrelevance. So the two powers leaned on each other. One carried swords, the other words, and between them, ordinary people found themselves watched from both earth and heaven. Yet belief itself was rarely neat. Old pagan customs still lingered beneath the surface. Charms tied to doorways, whispered spells against sickness, little offerings left at wells or crossroads. To the people who practiced them, these were not acts of rebellion. They were insurance. The world was unpredictable, and it made sense to cover every possibility. The same person who knelt at Mass might also mutter an old rhyme over a wound, just in case. When something went wrong, a failed crop, a sudden fever, accusation followed quickly. A woman who quarrelled too often, a man who kept to himself, a stranger with an unfamiliar accent. Someone had to be responsible. And once fear turned to certainty, punishment followed as a kind of relief. Better one person suffer than the whole village live under suspicion. Punishment was also politics. A ruler who punished decisively appeared strong. One who hesitated appeared weak. Public justice was a display of control, and the crowd was part of the performance. Chroniclers from the 13th and 14th centuries describe processions where condemned criminals were paraded through the streets before execution. Priests chanted, guards marched, and the condemned walked barefoot, holding candles. For the onlookers it was both frightening and strangely reassuring. Society for a moment felt united. The guilty were known. Order had spoken. It is easy now to see cruelty in these scenes, but most witnesses did not. They saw continuity. They believed that through these acts the fragile peace of their world would last another day. Even small punishments carried that symbolic weight. A tavern owner who watered his ale might be ordered to pour it out publicly. A dishonest merchant might be forced to stand by his stall while his goods were burned. Humiliation was as valuable as pain. It taught through memory. Fear held this system together, yet it was not always heavy. It was woven into life like the threads of a worn cloak, uncomfortable but familiar. People joked about it, warned their children with it, told stories by firelight of foolish thieves or clever tricksters who escaped the hangman's noose. Laughter softened fear, but never erased it. At night, the same villagers who had jeered at the stocks crossed themselves or whispered charms before sleep. They locked their doors not just against thieves, but against judgment, against dreams that might carry omens. The world outside the candle's glow was vast and uncertain, and punishment, for all its brutality, was a reminder that rules still existed, that someone, somewhere, was keeping count. In a modern world, punishment often hides behind walls, prisons, institutions, courts sealed away from daily life. In the medieval one, it stood in the open. That visibility mattered. People learned by seeing. A single whipping could educate 100 bystanders more effectively than a dozen laws no one could read. Pain was communication. It said, "This act was wrong. This person paid. Now we may continue." No one imagined it pleasant, but few imagined society could function without it. It was to them a grim necessity, like winter or plague, part of the rhythm of existence. And so punishment became not just a tool but a language. It spoke to the body when words failed the mind. It reminded everyone of the invisible line between belonging and exile. To cross that line was to risk the body so that the community might keep its peace. All of this, the fear, the spectacle, the mixture of faith and practicality, formed a fragile order. It did not guarantee justice as we would know it. Many suffered unfairly, many escaped through privilege or luck, but the system endured because it gave shape to anxiety. In a world of constant uncertainty, any structure was better than none. When the day ended, villagers returned to their homes, shutters closed against the wind. Some prayed, others simply sat by the fire, quiet, watching sparks rise into the dark. They knew that tomorrow might bring hunger, or rain, or rumour, but for tonight the world felt stable. Someone had been judged, and that, in its own cold way, was comfort. By the time the 13th century arrived, Europe had grown crowded. Towns were swelling with trade, markets spilled into muddy lanes, languages mixed in the same square. With so many people living side by side, punishment had to adapt. It was no longer just a village affair. It was a public instrument, a statement of power in an increasingly complex world. City walls rose, and with them came new sounds. The iron ring of hammers, the shuffle of guards' boots, the creak of gates opening at dawn. Justice found new stages, stone courtyards, pillories set before city halls, platforms built for both trial and display. The air of the towns was thicker, not only with smoke but with gossip. Rumour could ruin faster than disease, and punishment often began in whispers long before a judge spoke. In this urban setting, the old rural customs of oath and honour started to change. Merchants wanted contracts, not curses. Guilds preferred written rules to folk sayings. Yet beneath these refinements, the same primitive current flowed, a hunger for visible correction, a craving to see wrongdoing answered. The audience had grown larger, but the drama stayed the same. Executions were still rare, but when they came, they were orchestrated with care. Trumpets sounded, guards formed a procession. The condemned was paraded through the streets so that all might watch the slow movement toward judgment. Some threw stones, others crossed themselves or whispered prayers. The mixture of pity and satisfaction was ancient, both sorrow for a fellow mortal and relief that it was not oneself climbing those steps. Chroniclers describe crowds waiting from dawn, the markets closing early, parents hoisting their children to see over shoulders. There was noise, laughter, weeping, prayer, and then silence, broken only by the creak of rope or the fall of steel. When it was over, the people drifted away, as if released from a spell. The world, they felt, was briefly in order again. The condemned man or woman became a mirror for the audience. Their suffering stood in for everyone's fears, Their punishment reaffirmed the fragile boundaries that kept society upright. The message was not subtle. Actions had weight, and the world did not forget. But most punishment was smaller, constant, and woven into daily life. The market cheat who used false weights might spend a morning tied to a post with his scales hung mockingly around his neck. The baker who sold light loaves might be forced to carry them through town, shouting his own crime. The gossip could be made to kneel at the church door holding a candle during Mass, her silence as public as her earlier words. These punishments were cheap and efficient, and everyone understood them. They relied not on bureaucracy but on shame. Reputation was a kind of currency, and humiliation could bankrupt a man faster than any fine. At the same time, small mercies appeared. Some magistrates allowed substitutes, a payment instead of a whipping, a pilgrimage instead of confinement. Justice was learning to calculate in coins as well as pain. Money, though unevenly spread, began to smooth the roughest edges of vengeance. The logic of punishment still leaned on belief. Superstition hovered over every verdict. An unexpected confession might be credited to divine inspiration, or to guilt gnawing the conscience like a rat. If a suspect fell ill before trial, it was a sign that God had already judged. Even simple accidents were read as omens. A rope breaking at the gallows meant the condemned might be innocent. A storm during an execution was taken as heaven's approval or anger, depending on who interpreted it. In this world, justice was never entirely rational, yet it made sense to those within it. The unseen world was part of the evidence. A magistrate might listen to testimony and then, in private, pray for guidance. He might look to the sky, notice a cloud's shape, or hear the cry of a raven and feel reassured or troubled. For the ordinary person, all of this formed the background hum of life. Punishment was not constant, but its possibility was. It was the quiet rule everyone lived under, the reminder that someone was always watching. Neighbours, stewards, saints, fate itself. Children learned early which gestures to avoid, which words could be mistaken for insult. Travellers memorized the customs of each town, where to bow, when to speak, how to show respect. Fear, in moderation, kept people careful, and care, in turn, kept peace. In that sense, fear functioned almost like infrastructure, unseen but holding everything up. Remove it, and trust would collapse. Let it grow too strong, and it would choke the life from the community. Medieval Europe constantly wavered between those two extremes. If we could walk through that landscape now, it would not appear especially grim. Much of it would seem ordinary. Muddy roads, wooden fences, the chatter of markets. The punishment stood quietly among them, part of the scenery. The weathered stocks at the corner of a square, the iron ring bolted to a wall, the worn steps leading up to a small platform outside the town gate. Children would play near these things without thought. Merchants might lean on them during conversation. Only when the instruments were used did they reclaim their darker purpose. A traveller passing through might see the remains of yesterday's justice, bits of rope, a patch of trampled earth, a scattering of candle wax where a penitent had knelt. The traces faded quickly, leaving behind only the memory, and that was enough. Punishment in the Middle Ages was not simply imposed from above, it was sustained from below. Communities accepted it because they believed they needed it. Every villager, every townsman took part by watching, judging, gossiping or testifying. Justice was a collective act, a performance in which everyone played a role. There was resignation in it, a sense that life would never be entirely fair, but it could at least be coherent. If rules were harsh, they were at least predictable. Better the cruel pattern you knew than chaos without pattern at all. So people obeyed. They paid their fines, whispered their confessions, endured their scoldings and returned to work. And life went on. At dusk, when the last shafts of sunlight struck the church tower or the manor roof, the village quieted. Voices softened. The day's judgments, great or small, were finished. Some went home angry, others relieved, most simply tired. And as darkness spread over fields and rooftops, another kind of order took hold, the slow, familiar order of night. Crickets chirped beyond the hedges, water dripped from gutters, and the faint smell of smoke hung in the air. Punishment, like the sound of the distant bell, became part of that nightly rhythm, steady, low, and strangely comforting in its repetition. For a world so vulnerable to accident and chance, certainty, even cruel certainty, was a kind of mercy. The rope, the fine, the lash, the prayer, all these things told the same story, that chaos could still be managed, that the fragile pattern of life might hold for one more day, and so it did. Before Europe had judges in robes and scrolls of parchment stamped with wax, it had memory. Old men who remembered how their fathers settled quarrels, women who recalled which families owed which debts of honour. Justice lived not in documents, but in people, carried from generation to generation like a story half sung, half feared. When a dispute broke out, a stolen sheep, a broken promise, a boundary argued over, the answer was found by gathering. Neighbours met beneath a tree or beside a hearth. They spoke, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Voices rose, faded, returned again. No one quoted statutes, because none were written. They spoke instead of how things have always been. This phrase, how things have always been, was the heart of early law. Custom was proof. Repetition was authority. If a practice had survived the memory of living men, it was taken as rightful. These unwritten laws were flexible, and that flexibility kept peace. A lord might enforce one version on his lands, a nearby monastery might follow another, a distant valley, isolated by winter roads, might invent its own. The map of medieval justice was not neat lines, but a patchwork quilt, sewn together by habit and convenience. Long before trials there were oaths. To swear was to bind one's soul to one's words. The accused would stand before witnesses, hand on a relic or a cross, and promise innocence. If he lied, the punishment would come not from men but from heaven itself. At least that was believed. Oaths made law personal. They relied on reputation. A man known for honesty could be believed by word alone, while a known liar might be doomed before he spoke. Sometimes oaths were tested through ordeal. The ordeal was not madness to those who practiced it. It was a ritual of truth. A man might carry a red-hot iron a few steps. If his hand healed cleanly after 3 days, God had judged him innocent. A woman accused of theft might be bound and cast into a river. If she floated, she was guilty. Water, the symbol of purity, was thought to reject the impure. It seems brutal to us, yet for many centuries it offered certainty when no other proof could be trusted. The ordeal also revealed something deep in the medieval imagination, the conviction that the natural world was alive with judgment. Fire, water, even the body's own wounds were believed to speak with divine honesty. People trusted these signs more than human words. They believed that God's hand might be cruel, but it was never wrong. As trade grew and kings extended their reach, words began to travel farther than memory could carry them. Writing returned. At first, charters recorded land, not law, who owned what, who swore loyalty to whom. But gradually those same parchments began to describe behaviour, obligations, dues, punishments. The voice of tradition turned into ink. Still, literacy was rare. A handful of clerks and priests controlled the written record. They became translators between worlds, the spoken customs of the people and the silent permanence of script. Through their hands, justice gained weight. A promise written down could outlive its maker. A fine recorded could be demanded years later. This slow shift from speech to text changed how punishment felt. It made the invisible visible. What had once been a matter of forgiveness or rumour now had evidence. Paper remembered what people wished to forget. In that way, writing itself became a kind of punishment, unblinking, impartial, and eternal. The more writing spread, the more rulers used it to bind their lands together. Kings issued decrees that mixed practicality with moral tone, commands to weigh bread properly, to keep roads clear, to attend mass, to pay taxes. Each law was both protection and threat. The king's peace promised safety, but it also demanded obedience. Local lords resisted. They preferred the old ways, flexible, negotiable, rooted in personal ties. But writing favoured distance. A command from a far-off court could now reach a village that the king himself might never see. The parchment travelled faster than power had ever travelled before. And yet, beneath these royal experiments, the old customs survived. When records failed or officials delayed, people still settled things as they always had, with witnesses, with oaths, with compensation and reconciliation. The written law existed above them like a cloud. The lived law, muddy and immediate, remained on the ground. As the church's influence grew alongside these new bureaucracies, another transformation began, the merging of sin and crime. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. Stealing a sheep offended one's neighbour, but also offended God. Lying in court broke an oath, but also broke a commandment. The boundary between moral failing and social harm blurred. This merging gave punishments a strange dual purpose. A fine restored a victim's property, but also cleansed the wrongdoer's conscience. A public confession served both the community and the soul. Justice was becoming a ritual of purification as much as deterrence, but it also created confusion. If crime was sin, could forgiveness erase guilt? If punishment purified, did it also redeem? Judges argued, priests advised, kings overruled, and ordinary people simply tried to keep out of the way. The outcome was a hybrid world, half sacred, half administrative, in which every action had two echoes, one in heaven, one on earth. By the end of the 12th century, Europe stood balanced between two worlds. Behind lay centuries of unwritten customs, kept alive by memory and myth. Ahead stretched the promise of codified law, precise and enduring. Between them, people moved carefully, uncertain which rules truly governed them. They might still appeal to ordeal, but also sign their names to a parchment. They might trust a priest's judgment one day, and a lord steward the next. It was a time of overlap, of gradual transformation rather than revolution, and in that twilight between old and new, punishment retained its ancient face. It was still public, still physical, still meant to teach through the body what the mind could not yet reason. But beneath it, the idea of order had begun to shift, from divine mystery toward human administration, from ritual to rule. The medieval world did not yet know it, but the seeds of modern justice were already planted in those dusty halls, in those murmured oaths, in the soft scratching of quills on parchment. They would take centuries to grow. By the 13th century, written law had reached nearly every corner of Europe, but few could actually read it. To most people, the law was still something spoken, a series of proclamations shouted in the square, or a decree read aloud by a clerk whose voice echoed between stone walls. The sound mattered more than the words themselves. The law was performance. It had to be heard to exist. On market days, officials would unroll a length of parchment, hold it high for all to see, and begin to read. The villagers listened half curiously, half fearfully. The sentences were long, filled with names and dates few understood. But the rhythm of the words, the steady official tone, was enough to remind everyone that authority was alive, awake, and listening. For a brief moment, even those who could not follow the meaning felt its weight. When the clerk finished, the parchment was rolled again, sealed, and stored away in a chest where no one outside the council would ever see it. Law, in practice, was sound that turned back into silence. Justice had many masters. A merchant might fall under the laws of his guild, the taxes of his city, and the decrees of his king, all at once. A monk answered to his abbot, to his bishop, and in theory to Rome. A farmer owed loyalty to a local lord but paid fines to the crown. These overlapping powers created confusion, but also opportunity. People learned to navigate them like currents in a river, appealing to one authority when another grew hostile, or slipping through gaps where the two disagreed. Justice for the clever could be negotiated. Yet for most, the law remained something distant, shaped in halls they would never enter. They experienced it not as a system, but as events, a summons, a fine, a confiscation of tools, a neighbour punished. The pattern was irregular but familiar, enough to teach caution, never enough to build trust. The arrival of written records made one change above all. Punishment became a ledger. Every fine, every confiscation, every act of restitution could now be recorded, balanced, and remembered. If you owed a debt, it was no longer a matter of memory. It existed in ink. Ink did not forgive. A lord might now trace your obligation years later and demand payment with proof. The weight of parchment replaced the weight of rumour, and while this made the world more predictable, it also made it colder. The human elements, the plea, the apology, the neighbour's mediation, were slowly replaced by figures and marks. Justice became arithmetic. A wrong had a price, a crime had a tariff. The lash and the coin shared equal authority. For the first time, people began to think of punishment as owing something to the state, not just to one's victim. The fine was not only repayment, it was participation in the machinery of order. Every payment confirmed the ruler's reach. Every record extended his memory. Another change crept quietly through cities. The appearance of walls, built for confinement. Earlier ages had used cells only to hold people until judgment. Now, rulers began to see imprisonment itself as punishment. It was cleaner than blood, cheaper than execution, and easier to reverse if mercy was shown. These early prisons were small, dark, and foul. Yet the idea behind them was revolutionary. Punishment by time. To be locked away was to lose days and weeks instead of flesh. The body survived, but the hours were taken. For the first time, justice measured suffering not in pain but in duration. Still, most sentences were brief. Long-term imprisonment cost too much. Chains, stocks, and exile remained more practical. Only later, in distant centuries, would prisons grow into their own empires of discipline. For those who stood accused, medieval law felt less like a machine and more like a storm. They waited not for verdicts but for moods. The local judge might be stern one day, distracted the next. The crowd's sympathy could tilt the outcome as easily as evidence. Trials were social events. They gathered the living memory of a community and turned it into decision. Witnesses swore oaths, while others whispered commentary from the back. A good reputation could outweigh facts. A rumour could become proof. Yet within this unpredictable theatre lay a strange fairness. Everyone, high or low, feared public shame, and that fear restrained many who might otherwise have risked crime. In its own rough way, reputation was law. The physical landscape reinforced this sense of order. Every village and town carried symbols of authority: a stone cross, a courthouse, a gallows, a pillory. They were landmarks of power. Travellers navigated by them just as they did by rivers or hills. A town without a visible place of punishment seemed ungoverned, unsafe. Even nature played a role. A crossroads, a bridge, a hill by the gate. These spots were chosen for justice because everyone passed them. Punishment was geography as much as policy. To hang a man at the border was to warn outsiders. To fine him at the market was to remind neighbours. The location told the story as clearly as the act itself. As the centuries turned, a quiet unease began to stir among scholars and clerics. They started to wonder whether pain truly produced truth. Was suffering a reliable test of guilt, or merely a spectacle of control? If God was just, why did innocent people still perish under lawful punishment? These were dangerous questions, whispered first in monasteries, then in universities. They did not end cruelty overnight, but they planted seeds of skepticism. Out of them would eventually grow the idea that justice might be grounded not in fear or faith, but in evidence. For now, though, the old order held. The written word had joined the spoken oath. Parchment had joined the pillory. Together they maintained the uneasy peace of a continent still half wild, half civilized, forever oscillating between mercy and control. When night fell over, the medieval town, the day's judgments faded into memory. Fires burned low behind shuttered windows. A clerk rolled up his parchments. A guard checked the lock on the jail. In the distance, a dog barked once, then silence returned. The machinery of law slept, but its echo lingered in every dream. The knowledge that morning would come, and with it, another reckoning. When we look back across the centuries, one of the strangest ideas to survive is that pain could heal. To the medieval imagination, suffering was not meaningless. It was a language that spoke directly to heaven. Every blow, every tear, every long fast was thought to write the same message. I am sorry. I have learned. Let the world be whole again. The belief did not begin with cruelty. It began with guilt. Life was short, unpredictable, and full of small transgressions that no one could entirely avoid. A stolen apple, a broken promise, a harsh word spoken in anger. People needed a way to lighten the invisible weight of those moments. so they turned pain into ritual. In the first centuries after Rome's collapse, there were few written rules about how to seek forgiveness. Communities improvised. A man who had wronged his neighbour might spend 40 days in silence or walk barefoot to a distant shrine. A woman who spoke falsehood might fast until her body trembled. These acts were not imposed by courts. They were self-prescribed offerings, gestures to show remorse. Slowly, priests began to guide them. Lists of sins and remedies appeared. Thin hand-copied books known as penitentials. They treated guilt like arithmetic. One lie equaled a week of fasting, one theft equaled a season of charity, and the killing of a man required years of abstinence and prayer. It was a neat idea. Sin measured, repentance counted, balance restored. But what began as spiritual bookkeeping soon slipped into social control. If every offence had a tariff, then penance could be traded. A rich man might feed the poor instead of starving himself. A soldier might fund a church instead of kneeling in it. Good works became currency, and redemption acquired an economy. At first, penance was private, a whisper between sinner and priest, but privacy could not teach. As towns grew, leaders realized that public repentance impressed spectators more effectively than sermons. A confessed adulterer standing barefoot in the snow told a story everyone understood. It was not only about the individual, it was about reinforcing the boundaries that kept society intact. And so, confession moved from shadow to stage. Markets became classrooms of morality. Spectators watched the guilty beg forgiveness, and for a moment, everyone felt lighter, cleansed by proxy. Public punishment taught through empathy and fear at once. It said, see what wrong looks like, and see that it can be undone, but only through pain. To modern ears, the logic sounds merciless. But within the medieval framework, it was merciful. Pain was proof. If you endured punishment without complaint, you showed sincerity. If you wept, you demonstrated awareness. The wound became a kind of signature beneath your confession, guaranteeing its truth. People did not yet separate the body from the spirit. To heal one, the other had to bleed. The whip and the prayer were the same sentence in two different alphabets. This belief also comforted those who imposed punishment. A priest, a sheriff, an abbot. They could see themselves not as executioners, but as physicians of the soul. Their instruments, whips, chains, fines, exile, were the tools of moral surgery. Every cut was meant to close a larger wound, the rift between order and disobedience. Across Europe, a traveller could trace entire landscapes of repentance. Pilgrimage routes wound toward Rome, Compostela, Canterbury. Roadside shrines appeared where sinners once knelt and swore new beginnings. Villages kept small crosses at their outskirts to mark where penitent processions had turned back toward home. Each journey was part punishment, part therapy. The pilgrim suffered from hunger, cold, and exhaustion, yet returned with a cleansed reputation. Communities celebrated their return as living proof that sin could be overcome through effort. In this way, endurance itself became holy. A life without hardship seemed suspicious, even dangerous, as though untouched by the discipline of God or man. Suffering, paradoxically, was safety. It showed that balance still functioned. By the High Middle Ages, civic rulers adopted this theology almost unconsciously. When they flogged a thief, they repeated the old idea of purifying through pain, but without its gentleness. Where once the aim was redemption, now it was deterrence. The ritual survived, but its meaning hardened. A sentence of lashes was no longer medicine for the soul. It was a warning carved into skin. Public penance blurred into punishment. Confession blurred into interrogation. The same gestures, kneeling, pleading, enduring, shifted from voluntary acts to mandatory ones. The law had borrowed the language of salvation and turned it into policy. As the bells marked the passing hours of each day, people accepted this mixture of mercy and menace without distinction. They had grown up inside it. It felt as natural as the change of seasons. To be judged was frightening, yes, but also reassuring. It meant the world was still paying attention, that wrongdoing could still be named, that chaos had not yet taken hold. When night fell, those who had confessed or suffered slept heavily. The ache in their limbs was more than exhaustion. It was certainty. They had done what must be done. Their pain, however small, had kept the universe in balance for one more turn of the earth. By the 14th century, the rhythms of penance had seeped into everything. There was almost no difference between moral discipline and civic order. To live among others meant to carry a small measure of guilt and to accept the rituals that washed it away. Every community became a kind of mirror. People watched one another constantly, how one prayed, how one dressed, how one spoke. A careless joke, a skipped holy day, a whispered complaint about taxes could turn into accusation. Not every punishment came from the law. Sometimes it came from looks. Shame was social currency. The church door, the marketplace, the well. Each was a stage where reputations rose and fell. Public penance didn't need violence to bite. Silence and exposure were enough. To stand alone while the town observed you was to feel the full weight of its moral gravity. And yet, this constant scrutiny also bound people together. If your neighbour sinned, it meant they were still human, still part of the same fragile order of error and forgiveness. Perfection was rare and almost suspicious. The real virtue lay in confessing before you were caught. The centuries' soundscape carried this atmosphere of repentance. Bells marked not only hours but moods, the slow toll for confession, the quick triple ring for mass, the deep evening note for the dying. Inside churches, low voices murmured through latticed screens. Outside, footsteps scuffed on cobblestone as those who had confessed walked home lighter but quieter. In towns during Lent, processions filled the streets. Men in coarse cloth walked barefoot, carrying candles or wooden crosses. Some struck their backs gently with cords, more symbol than injury. The onlookers said little. They understood the ritual, an annual reminder that even the faithful needed repair. These spectacles were not the cruelty of later centuries. They were rehearsals of humility. Everyone took part, some as participants, some as witnesses, all as believers in the same delicate equation. Pain paid the debt, and balance returned. Still, the idea of cleansing through suffering gave enormous power to those who administered it. A priest could withhold absolution. A judge could demand a harsher display. A noble could pardon, and in pardoning appear godlike. Mercy became another form of control. Pardons were valuable. They were given to soldiers before battle, to thieves who served as executioners, to prisoners who informed on others. Each pardon told the public that grace could be earned, but also bought. It softened authority without ever challenging it. The line between spiritual discipline and political theatre blurred. When a ruler built a hospital or a chapel, he announced both faith and dominance. When he punished a criminal in public, he reminded the crowd that he alone held the right to cleanse through pain. Justice and redemption had become two hands of the same body. Travellers wrote of arriving in new towns and seeing, before anything else, the instruments of correction, stocks near the gate, a whipping post by the fountain, sometimes a single shoe or torn cloak left behind, a small relic of the last punishment. These objects spoke louder than laws. They said simply, "Here, wrongdoing has a cost." Parents pointed them out to children as warnings. Merchants nodded toward them when deals were made. Even when empty, they worked. Fear required no maintenance. The most common sentence was still the simplest. A few lashes, a day in the pillory, a fine to the Lord. But the message those sentences carried was enormous. They turned morality into landscape. The town itself became a moral map. Safe corners, dangerous corners, the invisible borders between respectability and disgrace. Despite all this control, medieval people did not see themselves as crushed beneath authority. They saw themselves as participants in a vast negotiation. They sinned, confessed, paid, and were restored. It was exhausting, but it worked. The system moved slowly, like a wheel grinding grain. Each life was a single turn. Belief gave meaning to the cycle. When plague struck, it was read as collective penance. When rain finally came after drought, it was seen as forgiveness. Every joy, every disaster reinforced the same idea. The world was moral, and justice, though painful, was proof that it still functioned. By the later Middle Ages, however, something changed in the tone. Penance no longer felt cleansing, it felt heavy. Wars dragged on, taxes grew, the church's own courts became entangled in wealth and politics. Ordinary people began to feel that sin was everywhere, and that no amount of fasting or punishment could wash it all away. Chroniclers of the time write of a weary faith, of men and women confessing by habit, not hope. The rituals remained, but the conviction behind them flickered. Pain still ruled, but its promise of redemption dimmed, and yet the structure endured. The lash still fell, the bell still rang, the confession still whispered through wooden screens. For better or worse, the belief that punishment could heal had built not just a theology, but an entire civilization. By the late Middle Ages, punishment had moved from the chapel to the street. The quiet ritual of confession was no longer enough. Cities were larger now, noisier, hungrier for order. Words alone could not control so many people living so close together. The law needed eyes. It needed the crowd. Public shame became the stage on which morality performed itself. The scaffold, the pillory, the stocks, they were not just tools, they were theatres, built to teach through humiliation what sermons could no longer reach. And every performance needed an audience. If you were to walk through a medieval city, the first thing you'd notice was how visible punishment had become. At the corner of the market stood a post, stained by weather and time, a wooden beam, a set of iron cuffs, a plank that could clamp around the neck. Not hidden behind walls, but placed deliberately where life happened, near the baker, near the fountain, near the church door. It was no accident. Punishment worked only when seen. A whipping in private meant nothing. A whipping before a crowd reminded hundreds that the line still existed. The city itself acted as the courtroom. Every window, every doorstep, another witness. On festival days or market mornings, The sound of a bell or trumpet might signal that justice was about to begin. People stopped what they were doing. Some leaned from windows, others left their stalls. The condemned was brought out, sometimes defiant, sometimes pale with fear, and placed where all could see. The air filled with a hum of expectation. Children perched on barrels, vendors paused in mid-sale. Then came the reading of the charge, slow and formal. It was less about the accused and more about the ritual itself. The words confirmed that the world still operated under rules, ancient, heavy, and unquestioned. To us the scene might seem cruel, but the medieval crowd did not think of itself as cruel. They saw themselves as part of a moral machine. Their presence completed the process. When they jeered, they believed they were helping justice do its work. When they laughed, they were cleansing the town of tension and fear. Even pity had its place. A murmured prayer, a coin dropped quietly near the punished person's feet. The emotions mingled: fascination, disgust, relief. For a few minutes, everyone's private guilt dissolved into shared experience. Punishment, after all, was never only for the guilty. It was for the watchers too. It reassured them that the world still made sense. The guilty paid, the innocent learned, and order, briefly, was restored. The instruments themselves were simple, but their meanings complex. The stocks, wooden boards with holes for the ankles, sometimes the wrists. Offenders sat for hours while passers-by mocked them, threw peelings or mud, or ignored them entirely. The real pain was not physical. It was the slow unravelling of pride. When released, many walked away uninjured, yet permanently smaller in spirit. The pillory, a frame that locked the head and hands upright. Placed high on a platform, it displayed the face, red, tear-streaked, exposed. The crowd might shout insults, but sometimes they offered food or drink, turning punishment into strange theatre. The victim's posture, helpless but visible, was designed to mimic moral nakedness. Sin had been caught. Now it could be seen. The whipping post, less symbolic, more direct. A short series of lashes across the back or shoulders was considered enough to cleanse minor crimes. Each stroke carried a rhythm that matched the words of the town crier. For theft, for lying, for disobedience. The list mattered as much as the lash. It turned pain into lesson. In each case, the humiliation was structured, almost choreographed. There was a beginning, a climax, and a release. When it ended, the crowd dispersed as if from a play. Punishment days were noisy, but between them the instrument stood silent, wooden reminders of authority. They weathered rain, they gathered dust. Children used them as games. Lovers met near them at night. They were part of the city's furniture, as ordinary as the well or the market cross. At times, civic festivals blurred entirely with punishment. A parade might pass the stocks. Actors dressed as devils and angels reenacted biblical justice. Mock trials amused crowds with staged confessions. Laughter and fear mixed freely. Morality, by then, had become entertainment. This blending was deliberate. Authorities understood that a show reached further than a sermon. The memory of a spectacle lingered longer than words. It painted boundaries in the mind, what one must never do, and what would happen if one did. Yet even in these public displays, small moments of humanity broke through. Chroniclers tell of towns where a condemned thief thanked his executioner for ending his suffering quickly, where a mother held her child's hand through the pillory's bars, where the crowd, moved by pity, demanded mercy from the magistrate and actually received it. These flashes of compassion didn't erase cruelty, but they revealed something deeper. People recognized themselves in the punished. They understood that the line between guilt and innocence was thin, sometimes invisible. They cheered loudly to keep that line in sight, because to imagine themselves on the other side was unbearable. After the spectacle ended, the true work of justice began in silence. The punished carried their shame home. The witnesses carried the story. By evening it had spread through taverns, whispered in kitchens, recited at bedsides. By morning it had already become cautionary legend. This was how order sustained itself, not through constant violence, but through memory. A punishment once seen could echo for years. The city required only the occasional performance to keep everyone acting their part. When darkness settled, torches were snuffed one by one. The square emptied, carts rattled away. The same space that had echoed with shouts now hummed only with the wind. Somewhere behind shutters, people spoke of what they'd seen, half horrified, half grateful, and above them all the tower bell tolled once more, marking the hour. It sounded the same whether for prayer, punishment, or peace. In that steady tone, medieval life found its rhythm again, harsh, ordered, and, to those within it, strangely comforting. The Middle Ages understood punishment as a kind of stage play that everyone had to attend. There were no posters, no tickets, no announcement other than the sound of a bell and the hush that followed. Yet everyone came, because everyone, sooner or later, needed to be reminded of the thin border between safety and disgrace. A town's calendar revolved around repetition, markets on Monday, worship on Sunday, punishment somewhere in between. These rhythms gave life structure. When the crier's voice rang through the streets, "Hear ye justice to be served," people didn't flinch. They adjusted their pace. The butcher set aside his cleaver. The baker left dough rising on the table. Justice, like weather, was simply part of the week. The condemned rarely came from far away. They were locals, the apprentice who'd stolen tools, the servant who'd lied, the woman who'd gossiped too freely. Seeing familiar faces made the lesson hit harder. It said, the rules apply to all of us. No one was too small to be judged, and no one too respectable to escape judgment. Afterward, life resumed almost immediately. A few coins exchanged hands, gossip thickened, and by sunset people spoke of it less. But the memory stayed, faint but enduring, like the smell of smoke after a fire has gone out. The imagery of punishment became its own language. A rope meant theft, an iron collar, disobedience, ashes scattered on the head, falsehood. Even the colours of garments carried meaning, yellow for betrayal, black for sacrilege, grey for deceit. Every mark on the body, every item of clothing told a story. People read these signs instinctively. A passer-by could glance once and understand everything. The crime, the sentence, the degree of shame. The punished became walking messages, physical warnings stitched into daily life. But this language had another layer. To some, it inspired fear. To others, fascination. Children asked questions their parents wouldn't answer. Writers and painters used the imagery in their art, transforming real pain into symbols of morality. Even guilt began to have an aesthetic. When the scaffolds were empty, their silhouettes haunted the skyline. Travellers described them as part of the city's identity, like towers or bridges. The scaffold said what no herald could. That order here was strong, and that mercy was not without its price. Public shame was not always solemn. In some towns, minor punishments were treated almost like sport. Crowds laughed at the drunkard wearing a paper crown, jeered at the dishonest baker forced to parade his burnt bread, or cheered when a gossip had to carry a caged bird, a visual joke on her own talkativeness. These moments blurred justice and entertainment so thoroughly that no one could tell where one ended and the other began. The laughter was genuine, but beneath it pulsed the same message. Be careful, or it could be you. Authorities tolerated this humour because it worked. Laughter disarmed rebellion. A population amused was a population controlled. Mockery achieved what swords could not. Quiet compliance through shared derision. And yet humour could shift to cruelty in an instant. A single insult too sharp, a stone thrown too hard, and the crowd's excitement turned feral. The same voices that demanded justice could within moments taste vengeance. The line between punishment and mob was thin and easily crossed. Not everyone watched loudly. Some stood at the back, silent, their arms folded. Older townsfolk, widows, craftsmen who had seen too many punishments to find pleasure in them. They watched because absence would be noticed. Skipping justice could look suspicious. So they attended, eyes lowered, enduring the ritual as one endures rain, quietly, without comment, waiting for it to pass. At home later, they spoke softly about what they'd seen, sometimes with pity, sometimes with resignation. A sigh, a small prayer, then silence. For them, the spectacle was no longer moral theatre. It was habit, a necessary act that kept the fragile peace from shattering. In the countryside, where towns were smaller, punishment took to the road. Travelling judges, called assizes, moved from village to village carrying the authority of the crown. Their arrival was both feared and celebrated. Trumpets announced them. Villagers gathered in the square to hear the new decrees. For 1 or 2 days, distant government became visible. The sentences were swift. A thief's hand branded, a debtor's goods seized, a drunk fined with public apology. Then the judges departed, leaving behind only the echo of their passing, the sense that law, though invisible most of the year, was still out there, watching, remembering. People spoke of these visits long after they ended. The memory of the travelling court lasted because it brought something tangible, spectacle wrapped in authority. And long after the carriages rolled away, the locals reenacted it in stories, keeping the hierarchy alive through words. Even when punishment ended, shame lingered like scent in wood. A man freed from the stock still carried their shape in his back and their weight in his heart. A woman forgiven by the court still met stares in the market. Forgiveness, officially granted, did not erase memory. Communities were small. Forgetting was impossible. Those once punished often moved away, not for opportunity but for anonymity. To start over, they had to vanish from the geography of their disgrace. The lucky ones found work in distant towns. The unlucky returned eventually to beg where they had once been mocked. And so the circle turned. Public shame kept crime visible, but it also created ghosts. People who lived among the others yet never again fully belonged. Their presence reminded everyone that justice, while claimed to be impartial, left deep personal shadows. By the 15th century, the constant rhythm of punishment began to slow. Cities were growing richer, more complex. Commerce demanded order, not spectacle. Merchants wanted stability, not crowds blocking streets to jeer at criminals. Law moved gradually indoors, records multiplied, courts specialized, punishments diversified. The stage did not vanish overnight, but it shrank. Where once the crowd was the judge, now it became an observer at a distance. Authority turned inward, quieter, bureaucratic. Public shame gave way to private fear, of summonses, of ledgers, of seals pressed into wax. And yet, the echo of those centuries remained. The instinct to display guilt, to make morality visible, never fully disappeared. It would resurface in new forms, in prisons built for observation, in the whispered gossip of small towns, in the hunger to see wrongdoing named and exposed. When the medieval crowd finally dispersed for good, they left behind a legacy larger than their laughter or their cruelty. They left the idea that justice must be seen to be believed. That belief, as old as the stocks and as modern as the courtroom camera, still haunts us. The Middle Ages had turned morality into theatre, and even when the curtains fell, the audience never really left. By the 14th century, the idea that pain could cleanse had become a quiet certainty. It moved through sermons and courtrooms, through monasteries and streets, until it seemed woven into the fabric of daily life. The body, once seen as frail and temporary, had become an instrument for testing the invisible: truth, loyalty, faith. People did not yet fear pain in the modern sense. They feared what pain might reveal. A confession whispered too soon, a cry mistaken for guilt, a wound that refused to heal. All could be taken as signs from heaven or proof of deceit. To endure pain calmly was virtue. To resist it wrongly was sin. Pain had always carried a strange prestige in Christian Europe. Centuries earlier, saints had described their torments not as curses but as gifts, proofs that they shared in Christ's suffering. Their stories spread like fire through the manuscripts copied in cloisters. A generation later, the same logic that sanctified martyrdom began to justify punishment. If the righteous could suffer willingly, then perhaps the wicked should suffer unwillingly. Either way, pain brought clarity. It separated truth from falsehood, purity from corruption, obedience from pride. Monks fasted until their hands shook. Hermits slept on cold stone wrapped in rags. They believed each ache carved away another layer of weakness. Ordinary people watched, awed and uneasy, and learned that endurance was holiness, even when it was imposed rather than chosen. In the dim rooms where trials were held, pain became a form of language. A confession whispered between gasps was considered more truthful than any calm statement. It seemed impossible that anyone would lie while suffering. The body, stripped of comfort, was thought incapable of deceit. The logic was circular but persuasive. The innocent would be protected by God, the guilty exposed by agony. And so, across Europe, interrogation adopted ritual. The instruments were crude: cords, pulleys, racks, but the philosophy behind them was meticulous. Pain was not meant to destroy the body, only to open it like a locked chest, revealing the truth within. Sometimes that truth came swiftly, sometimes it never came at all. But the faith in the method endured, because it aligned with the deeper rhythm of the age. Truth and suffering were twins. To one who had grown up among fasts and flagellations, the idea felt almost comforting. Beyond the courtroom, suffering took on an economic logic. A sin, once confessed, still required payment. That payment could be gold, or it could be pain. The rich gave alms and built chapels. The poor offered their bodies, fasting, walking barefoot, enduring small humiliations in public. It was a system everyone understood. Pain, like money, could be counted. 3 lashes for blasphemy, 7 for theft, 20 for adultery. The balance was restored, the account settled. It was cruel arithmetic, but in a world governed by exchange, labour for bread, taxes for protection, sin for penance, it felt natural. Pain was the one currency that every class possessed. Even the poorest could pay with it. One of the strangest and most haunting expressions of this belief was the flagellant movement. Bands of men and women walked from town to town during plagues and wars, their backs bare, their hands holding cords knotted with iron. They sang low hymns as they struck themselves rhythmically, blood mixing with dust. Crowds watched in silence. Some joined them, some prayed for them, some fled. To the flagellants, pain was not despair, but protest, against sin, against corruption, against a world sliding into decay. They believed each blow cleansed not only their own souls, but the sins of the cities they passed through. Their processions were part punishment, part prayer, part theatre of redemption. Authorities eventually banned them, frightened by their fanaticism. But the memory remained, the sight of bodies turning pain into hope. It was both terrifying and strangely beautiful, a kind of moving confession that left no room for words. In monasteries, pain was quieter, but no less deliberate. Discipline was daily. Cold water at dawn, hard benches, long hours of kneeling. Not every monk believed in harshness, but most accepted it. Comfort was distraction. Discomfort kept the spirit sharp. One monk wrote that pain reminded him of time. Each sting a moment passing, each ache a step closer to salvation. Others saw it as conversation with God, the only one the body could truly understand. And outside the monastery, peasants absorbed these lessons. They could not read the scriptures, but they could read the example. To endure hardship without complaint became the silent mark of virtue. The field hand, the soldier, the servant, all learned to carry pain as quietly as possible, for endurance itself was the only praise most would ever earn. The connection between pain and purity ran deep into superstition. People believed that suffering burned away invisible stains. If an illness struck suddenly, it might be punishment. If it passed quickly, it was cleansing. When a woman gave birth in agony and survived, neighbours said her pain had baptized her anew. When an old man died peacefully after long sickness, his patience was admired as proof that he had paid all debts of sin. Pain was everywhere, in work, in punishment, in faith, in life. But it was not meaningless, it was explanation. It was the language by which an uncertain world tried to understand itself. And yet, amid all this acceptance of pain, compassion quietly grew. Healers began to write of easing suffering rather than interpreting it. Herbalists mixed salves not only for wounds but for mercy. Midwives whispered prayers not to endure but to spare. The contradiction was never resolved. To comfort pain risked defying divine will, yet to ignore it felt inhuman. So the two instincts lived side by side, the lash and the balm, the punishment and the prayer. This tension would define the centuries to come, a civilization that saw pain as both sacred and shameful, necessary and wrong, punishment and proof. When night fell over the monasteries and villages, the same candles flickered behind narrow windows. Some burned before icons of saints who had bled for their faith. Others burned beside the beds of the sick. where families whispered for relief. Between those two flames lay the entire paradox of the medieval world, that pain was at once the enemy and the cure, the price of order and the promise of grace. And somewhere in that fragile light, humanity rested again, believing that through suffering it might still be made clean. By the 15th century, pain was no longer just a feeling. It had become an institution. Its rules were written, its thresholds debated, its purposes endlessly discussed in both monasteries and courts. Suffering had become a kind of grammar, something everyone could read, even if few truly understood it. Once pain became the accepted path to truth, officials began to measure it. There were limits now, written in careful language. How many lashes for theft, how tight the ropes could be drawn, how long the accused might be suspended before the mercy of release. It was control disguised as compassion, an attempt to civilize the cruelty they could not yet abandon. Theologians wrote about the difference between necessary pain and excessive pain. Necessary pain purified, excessive pain corrupted. But who could measure a soul's threshold? No law, no priest, no physician could truly say where cleansing ended and destruction began. So the decisions fell to individuals, to magistrates with tired eyes, to inquisitors who believed they were doing sacred work, to executioners who knew exactly how much pressure a body could endure before it broke. They became craftsmen of agony, adjusting their skill to the boundaries of what society allowed. Each act was both procedure and prayer. The body, once seen as fragile, became a tool to be tuned and tested. Its endurance proved innocence. Its collapse proved guilt. Pain became not chaos but calibration. For the crowd, the logic was simple. They did not ask whether the punished deserved it. They only watched how the punished behaved. If the condemned screamed and begged, they were guilty. If they remained calm, perhaps they were innocent. Or perhaps, as some whispered, God had already claimed them. Either way, pain confirmed that justice was real. There was comfort in that. In a world of disease and famine where life could vanish overnight, the sight of punishment suggested that at least some order endured. The world might be cruel, but it was not random. Every cry had a reason. Some believed that even the instruments themselves absorbed a kind of holiness. The whip, the rope, the wheel, objects of terror, were also tools of purification. They were treated with a certain reverence, kept clean, sometimes blessed. To handle them carelessly was to disrespect the ritual of justice. Thus cruelty wrapped itself in ceremony. The executioner, far from being a mere brute, was often considered necessary, even honourable in his grim way. He did what others could not bear to do, the unpleasant work that kept the balance between sin and salvation. Children were taught to fear him, but also to respect him. It is easy to imagine the punishers as monsters, but they lived within the same world of belief as everyone else. Many prayed before their work. Some asked forgiveness from the condemned. They saw themselves as servants of order, not villains of chaos. To doubt that role was to collapse under its weight. Chroniclers tell of executioners who retired to monasteries, seeking peace for the things they had seen and done. Others became legends, remembered not for cruelty but for efficiency, for giving the condemned a good death. Mercy and horror blurred until they were indistinguishable. The same contradiction lived in the hearts of onlookers. They watched with fascination but also shame. They condemned cruelty in private and yet came again to witness it. Pain, they believed, revealed truth, not only in the punished, but in themselves. Even art began to reflect this fixation. Church walls filled with images of martyrdom, saints pierced by arrows, burned at stakes, crushed by stones. These scenes were not meant to horrify, but to inspire. They told believers that suffering could be transcendent, that endurance could transform weakness into holiness. Artists painted the moment before death with calm faces, serene eyes turned upward. The message was clear. Pain might rule the body, but faith ruled the soul. In sculpture, the crucifixion was repeated endlessly, each version emphasizing agony and peace in the same breath. Children grew up surrounded by these images. They learned to read suffering as beauty, torment as grace. This aesthetic shaped not only religion but law. Judges and priests both absorbed the same visual vocabulary, order maintained through pain, purity born from endurance. A culture that decorated its walls with agony could not easily question its own punishments. Yet not everyone accepted this equilibrium. Among healers and early physicians, a quiet rebellion began. They studied pain not as symbol, but as symptom. To them, it was something to be reduced, not revered. They wrote about herbs, poultices, and techniques for easing fever and ache, small acts of defiance against the great machinery of redemptive suffering. Still, they worked cautiously. To remove pain entirely might appear unholy. Relief had to be framed as aid, not resistance, and so even mercy bowed to theology. A doctor could soothe pain, but only while reminding the patient that some suffering was still required, that healing must not outrun the soul's penance. Thus even compassion remained chained to the old logic, pain as purification, comfort as indulgence. Pain also served the economy of control. Punishments required labour, builders for scaffolds, guards for prisoners, craftsmen to forge iron, scribes to record confessions. Whole trades depended on the existence of suffering. To abolish pain would have been to unmake livelihoods. The wheel turned not only in the square but behind closed doors, in workshops and treasuries. Every fine, every instrument, every confession added weight to the system. Justice had become an industry. Yet, under all this order, cracks began to show. Philosophers questioned whether pain truly purified or merely silenced. Mystics wrote of divine love that asked no suffering at all, and common people, exhausted by endless wars and plagues, began to wonder if they had suffered enough. They no longer feared chaos as much as they feared endurance. Pain had once promised meaning, now it merely promised more pain. In that exhaustion lay the seed of change. The faint idea that suffering might be a problem to solve rather than a truth to accept. But that idea was still centuries from bloom. When the day ended in a medieval town, the instruments were covered, the prisoners locked away, the candles extinguished. The square grew silent. From the distance came the slow echo of a bell marking the hour. People crossed themselves, whispered prayers, and went to sleep believing, as generations before them had believed, that through pain the world remained clean, and that somewhere someone was paying their price for everyone else. By the middle of the 13th century, Europe had learned how to question its own people. It no longer waited for confessions whispered to priests or punishments handed down by lords. Now it began to ask directly and systematically what each soul believed. Doubt, once private, had become a public matter. The Inquisition was not born in thunder. It began quietly, with paperwork. Letters from bishops to Rome, instructions from popes to monks, requests for clarity. How should the Church deal with heresy? The word itself came from the Latin inquirere, to inquire, to seek. At first it meant only investigation, but soon investigation meant interrogation, and interrogation meant suffering. To medieval Europe, heresy was infection. It moved silently through speech and rumour, spreading doubt the way plague spread fever. You could not always tell who carried it. A neighbour, a teacher, a friend might suddenly question a doctrine, a saint, a miracle. And because faith held the world together, even a single question felt dangerous. To defend belief was to defend existence. So the Inquisition grew out of fear, not of power, but of collapse. If people stopped agreeing on truth, everything else might fall apart. In some ways, it was an early attempt at order. It promised consistency, procedure, record-keeping. But in practice, it became a new kind of theatre. Pain turned into paperwork. An inquisitor did not arrive like an army. He came with books, not swords. He set up in a hall or monastery, hung a cross on the wall, and summoned witnesses one by one. People came because refusal looked like guilt. The questioning was deliberate, calm, and endless. What did you say to your neighbour? Did you doubt the miracle? Did you attend the sermon? Did you, in your heart, believe exactly as the Church believes? It was impossible to answer perfectly because belief is never perfect. Each hesitation, each pause, could be taken as proof of deceit. And so, sooner or later, fear led to confession. At first, punishments were mild: pilgrimages, fines, public prayers. But repetition hardened the process. Investigators wanted certainty. Certainty required confession, and confession required pressure. The wheel turned again. Unlike earlier punishments, inquisitorial justice left mountains of words. Scribes sat beside the questioning benches, recording every phrase, every sob, every contradiction. The parchment that survived still carries traces of those moments. Stains from candle wax, ink blotted by trembling hands. For the first time, suffering gained a bureaucracy. There were forms, categories, instructions. Torture, once improvisation, became a regulated method, complete with margins for the number of turns of a rope, the minutes of suspension, the allowable cries. Each detail was justified in the language of mercy. Better a moment's pain now than eternal damnation later. Sentences were public. The auto da fe, the act of faith, was a ceremony of punishment and forgiveness performed before vast crowds. It began with chants, then processions of the accused wearing robes marked with symbols of their crimes. Some were spared, others burned, all displayed. The crowd prayed as the flames rose. For many the spectacle felt holy, the cleansing of error, the reaffirmation of unity. Smoke carried souls to heaven or warnings to earth, no one was sure which. The same contradiction that had lived in every monastery now towered over cities. Compassion through pain, purification through death. Not all inquisitors were monsters. Some were scholars who believed deeply in the mission of truth. They wrote careful manuals instructing that torture should be brief, that repentance should always be offered first, that confession given freely was better than confession taken by force. But ideals erode under fear. Once pain proved useful, it became habit, and habit, in time, became belief. There were others who resisted quietly. Local priests who delayed trials, nobles who sheltered the accused, townspeople who lied to protect friends. Yet every act of mercy carried risk. To question the process was to risk joining it. The machine of inquiry did not need cruelty from everyone, only obedience from most. Entire regions lived under the shadow of suspicion. Southern France, northern Italy, parts of Spain, places where ideas moved faster than authority, became centres of scrutiny. To live there meant to live half afraid of your own words. At night, families whispered prayers not just for salvation, but for secrecy. Confession, once a path to peace, became dangerous. Anything said could return twisted. Silence itself became suspicious, and so communities learned to speak in half-sentences, gestures, glances. Trust shrank to the size of a household. The Inquisition did not merely punish heresy. It changed how people thought. It taught them to edit themselves. To those who ran it, the Inquisition was proof that the world could still be kept pure. To these who endured it, it was proof that purity was an illusion. For every soul reclaimed, another was broken. For every heresy extinguished, another doubt was born in silence. And yet the system persisted because it answered fear with formality. It offered the comfort of order in an age that had forgotten peace. People preferred cruelty they could predict to chaos they could not. In this sense, the Inquisition was less a monster than a mirror. It reflected the logic of its time, that truth was fragile, and that pain, carefully administered, might keep it alive. When evening fell after a day of trials, the Inquisitor's hall emptied, the candles guttered. A clerk closed the record book, its pages still damp with ink. Outside, the city breathed again, uneasy, quiet, pretending nothing had happened. And as the moon climbed above tiled roofs, its light fell on both the hall and the prison below it, touching them equally. In that cold, light, justice and suffering looked the same, two shadows cast by the same belief that certainty was worth any cost. The Inquisition did not appear everywhere at once. It moved like weather, slow, uneven, inevitable. Some regions heard of it only through rumour, a whisper from merchants, a sermon about distant trials, a name spoken carefully in taverns. Elsewhere it arrived as routine, folded into daily life so gradually that people barely noticed the change. Soon there were offices in nearly every city of importance, windowless rooms where parchment stacked higher than the candles that lit them. Each town had a clerk, a notary, a guard, an appointed witness. The bureaucracy of belief had found permanence. A strange stillness settled over Europe. Words grew cautious, conversations shortened. Children learned, earlier than they learned to read, which topics to avoid. To ask too much was to attract attention. To speak carelessly was to invite ruin. Every household carried invisible lines between safety and danger. One could discuss the harvest, the weather, a saint's feast day. But one could not discuss why prayers sometimes went unanswered, why priests disagreed, or why misfortune fell on the good. Such questions had once belonged to philosophers. Now they belonged to prosecutors. People began to edit their own minds, shaping thoughts that would sound harmless if ever repeated. It was not only speech that changed, but imagination. Curiosity became a risk. Silence became a habit. The Inquisition called itself merciful. It promised not execution but reconciliation. Its officials wrote that their duty was to save souls, not destroy them. The stake and the rope, they argued, were not ends but warnings, tools to bring others back to truth before death. In this way, mercy and terror merged until no one could tell them apart. The same act, a confession torn from a frightened man, could be described in official records as divine victory. The paperwork always ended in relief. Another soul rescued, another heresy erased, another example made. Each conclusion tidy, each signature neat, each life reduced to a sentence that declared the work successful. Behind the rhetoric lay exhaustion. The officials themselves often doubted, but procedure was comfort. It replaced thought with rhythm, fear with form. They convinced themselves that process was justice, that a world filled with uncertainty needed this structure to survive. Confession became the bridge between faith and punishment. At first, it was voluntary, whispered in the dim light of churches. Under the Inquisition, it became public record. Words once meant to free the soul could now imprison the body. People still confessed, but now they rehearsed beforehand, measuring every phrase, anticipating suspicion. Confession was performance, a delicate balancing act between honesty and survival. Those who denied guilt entirely were seen as obstinate. Those who confessed too eagerly were suspected of manipulation. The only safe path was the one no one could define, a careful middle ground of remorse without resistance. Even the innocent learned to shape their stories toward that narrow path. The truth mattered less than tone. A trembling voice sounded holier than a steady one. Tears were safer than reason. Emotion, once private, became evidence. In towns where the Inquisition took root, architecture began to change. Houses leaned inward, their upper stories closing like eyelids over the street. Windows narrowed, thresholds thickened. Even the built world seemed to flinch. Public squares that had once hosted markets and festivals now carried an undertone of surveillance. A stranger asking for directions could raise suspicion. A group lingering too long after dusk might be reported. Fear became civic design, invisible walls within the visible ones. At night, the bell still rang, but the sound felt different. Each chime reminded listeners that time itself belonged to someone else, the authorities who set the rhythm of worship, work, and obedience. People prayed because silence sounded too much like guilt. For rulers, the Inquisition was a convenient partner. It offered what no army could: control of thought. Lords who feared rebellion learned that faith could discipline where weapons could not. And so the alliance deepened, crown and cross, each strengthening the other's authority. Taxes funded the inquiries, fines from the accused funded cathedrals and roads. Faith financed empire. Pain became the silent currency of administration. Even the condemned, in a strange way, participated. Their punishments drew crowds, reaffirmed hierarchies, filled the gaps between harvests and wars with spectacle. The suffering of a few kept the obedience of many. Some inquisitors left letters behind, weary, self-questioning documents that survived only by accident. They wrote of sleepless nights, of doubts they could never voice. One asked whether the devil's greatest trick might be convincing good men to hunt him endlessly. Another wondered if heresy multiplied because the act of seeking it created more of it. These voices were few, and they spoke softly, but they reveal the truth that every system of fear eventually consumes its own believers. When every doubt is dangerous, even loyalty starts to look suspicious. Despite its reach, the Inquisition never truly conquered Europe. It could burn bodies, but not thoughts. It could silence, but not convince. Dissent hid in songs, in riddles, in stories told to children. Philosophers disguised questions as fables. Poets turned argument into allegory. Even in the strictest towns, laughter survived. Quiet, but stubborn. The human mind found corners untouched by authority. In those corners, change waited. It would take centuries, but the habit of secrecy would one day become the habit of independence. When dusk fell on a city ruled by inquiry, smoke from the bakeries mixed with smoke from the pyres. The difference was smell, not symbol. Both fed the same hunger, the need to believe the world could be purified by fire. As darkness deepened, the Inquisitor's offices closed. Candles were snuffed, pens set down, the ink cooled, sealing another day's confessions beneath its sheen. And outside, the same quiet order returned, the illusion that nothing had happened and that peace still lived in the silence between questions. For centuries, Europe believed that pain could reveal what speech might hide, and so, in dim stone rooms and timber halls, a strange kind of craftsmanship developed. The building of tools meant not to kill, but to extract truth from silence. They were not always as elaborate as legend later claimed. Most were simple, almost plain: wood, rope, iron, fire. What made them terrible was not their shape, but their purpose. Each was designed around one conviction: that the body could speak the mind's secrets if persuaded firmly enough. To medieval interrogators, pain was conversation. They believed the soul might lie, but the flesh would confess. A tightened cord, a sudden shock, a controlled burn, each was a question to which the body must answer. They called it the question. Not torture, never cruelty, always the question. It sounded orderly, almost intellectual, as if suffering could be translated into knowledge. And in a way, it was. Each cry, each gasp, each word uttered under pressure became data, evidence of guilt, proof of error, reassurance that justice still functioned. The rack was the most infamous. A wooden frame, heavy and creaking with rollers at each end. The victim's wrists tied to one, ankles to the other. Each turn of the handle stretched the body fraction by fraction, bones moving, joints straining, tendons tightening like ropes ready to snap. It rarely killed. It simply rearranged the body until truth arrived. The strappado looked harmless by comparison. A rope, a pulley, an open beam. Hands bound behind the back, the body lifted until shoulders dislocated with a muted crack. To inquisitors, this was elegance, clean, controlled, effective. They believed the pain purged sin even as it extracted confession. The boot was more intimate. A wooden casing fitted around the leg, wedges driven between flesh and plank with a hammer's rhythm. It sounded like carpentry, each strike deliberate, measured. The body turned into material for revelation. And then there were the smaller instruments: thumbscrews, irons, pincers. Simple enough to fit in a drawer, yet capable of erasing pride faster than sermons ever could. Their very simplicity comforted those who used them. A tool so ordinary could not, they reasoned, be evil. To modern minds, these acts seem like madness, but to those within that world they were ceremony. Each stage was documented, timed, witnessed. The room was swept clean before and after. A priest might stand nearby, murmuring prayers, ready to record repentance. Scribes dipped quills, noting every word. The accused, stripped of control, became both participant and offering. Their suffering was meant to restore balance, to reaffirm the order that faith promised but fear continually threatened. Pain was not chaos. It was proof that rules still applied. When the confession finally came, half truth, half surrender, it was treated as revelation. The words were transcribed, sealed, and read aloud as if divinely granted. The scream had become scripture. The rooms used for such questioning were rarely dungeons. They were ordinary chambers, low ceilings, narrow windows, the smell of wax and iron. Light fell unevenly, cutting faces into halves of shadow and gold. This contrast pleased the chroniclers who described it later. It symbolized, they said, the difference between ignorance and enlightenment. Order, even in agony, mattered. Everything had to appear deliberate. Wild cruelty was frowned upon, not out of pity but out of pride. Justice had to look calm, or else it would resemble vengeance. The true inquisitor did not rage. He adjusted ropes with precision. That distinction between rage and routine was what allowed civilization to keep its conscience. As long as suffering was procedural, it could be justified. To understand this world, one must imagine a time when the body was seen as both enemy and messenger. Its pain could betray, but also redeem. When flesh trembled, people believed the soul was speaking, and so, paradoxically, the more the body suffered, the more trustworthy it became. Every mark left behind, the burn, the scar, the limp, was considered evidence that truth had passed through the skin. Pain wrote what ink could not. The condemned sometimes accepted this logic themselves. Many begged not for release, but for purity, that their endurance might wash away the stain of error. It was madness by modern measure, but within their world it made sense. Suffering was a ladder, and each rung of agony lifted the soul closer to light. Few ever saw these sessions, but everyone knew they existed. The rumour of pain was enough. It hung in the air like smoke, unseen but smelled everywhere. Townspeople did not need to witness the question to feel its pressure. It kept speech cautious, thought disciplined. Fear became invisible infrastructure. It held communities upright without a single guard on the street. The possibility of agony replaced the need for its constant display. At its heart, the ritual of truth contained a contradiction it could never resolve. The belief that divine love required human suffering to reveal itself. The inquisitors called their work mercy, the victims called it fate, and the bystanders called it order. Each name softened the same noise, the creak of rope, the prayer half spoken, the truth half believed. And when it was over, when the confession was signed and the tools wiped clean, the silence that followed felt holy. The air smelled of iron and candle soot. The world outside resumed, as though nothing extraordinary had happened, because in that century nothing could be more ordinary than pain. When night came, the hall stood empty again. A single candle burned down beside the parchment, its wax hardening around the quill. From the street below came faint music, someone singing to themselves, unaware or pretending not to be aware of what the building above them contained. And for a brief moment, the city seemed peaceful. But beneath the cobblestones and in the memory of the people, the instruments waited, silent, clean, ready, as constant as faith itself. By the late Middle Ages, the mechanics of pain had become so refined that cruelty no longer needed to call itself cruelty. It had become administration. Each act, each word, each turn of a wheel had its place in the same unbroken rhythm. Question, answer, record, penance, silence. It was not chaos that frightened people anymore. It was order, because order now could hurt you. The rooms where truth was drawn out were always colder before sunrise. The air held that stillness between night and morning when the city outside had not yet begun to stir. The officials liked to begin early. They said fatigue softened the spirit, that the accused, half dreaming, might speak honestly without realizing it. The torches hissed faintly, shedding smoke that clung to the walls. A table, a rope, a stool for the clerk. Nothing more. The scene was simple, because simplicity made it believable. When the accused entered, they were met not with shouting but with politeness. A greeting, a cup of water, a moment to collect themselves. The interrogator smiled. He asked questions softly like a teacher. Only when answers strayed did the ritual begin. No rage, no chaos, just the sound of wood and breath and distant bells marking the hour. Every generation refined the devices it inherited. The rack became smoother, its joints quieter. Metal replaced rope, not for efficiency, but for precision. Pain could now be increased gradually, as predictably as the turning of a clock. The more precise the instruments became, the less responsibility anyone felt. Pain had become mechanical, and so, in their minds, neutral. The tool decided how much. The man merely operated it. Scribes recorded every word with almost artistic care. They noted the time of each confession, the tone of voice, the exact phrasing. Truth, once abstract, was now documented in measurable units. Pain had turned morality into data. At the edge of the room, a priest might stand silently, lips moving in prayer. To him, the scene was not punishment, but penance. The body's suffering was the soul's purification. He would write later that mercy had been shown, that the accused had been given every chance to repent, that heaven itself had been invited to witness. It was an echo of the older world, the monastery's belief that pain could heal, but now stripped of its innocence. This was pain without intimacy, no longer chosen, no longer spiritual, only procedural. The language of redemption survived, but its heart had cooled. Outside these chambers, life went on. Bells rang, carts rolled through streets, apprentices called out to one another. A fishmonger shouted prices, unaware, or pretending not to know, that only a few alleys away, someone was confessing under duress. The distance between the sacred and the ordinary had collapsed. Pain had become background noise, faint but constant, like the clatter of hooves on cobblestone. Everyone heard it. No one acknowledged it. That silence was the true genius of the age. It made horror sustainable. Every system teaches, and cruelty was no exception. Young officials learned by watching. They studied where to stand, how to adjust the tension, when to pause, how to write clearly even when the room was shaking with cries. They learned to keep their faces neutral, their voices level. Compassion was inefficiency. Doubt was disorder. One chronicler described an apprentice who fainted during his first questioning. His mentor scolded him, not for weakness, but for spectacle. "Never make the pain about you," he said. And in that single phrase lay the logic of the entire institution. Suffering must always look controlled. The tools themselves outlived their makers. When inquisitions moved or ended, the instruments were stored away, locked in cellars, labelled for future use. Some were repurposed by later courts, some forgotten, some found centuries later and displayed behind glass. Time stripped them of power and turned them into relics. Visitors now stare at them in silence. The wood is cracked, the iron rusted, the joints stiff with age. They no longer function as instruments, only as questions. How could people have believed in them? But belief, once woven deeply enough, is invisible while it lasts. No one in those centuries thought of themselves as cruel. They thought of themselves as careful. After each confession, there was always the same ending. The ropes were loosened, water offered, wounds dressed. The interrogator spoke kindly again, reminding the penitent that forgiveness was possible. A signature followed, sometimes shaking, sometimes serene. The parchment folded, sealed, filed. The entire ritual ended not in shouting but in paperwork. Pain dissolved into ink, and once the record was complete, the body no longer mattered. It had done its work. Centuries later, long after the instruments had vanished from daily use, their logic endured. School still demanded discipline. Court still demanded confession. Parents still told children that hardship builds character, that suffering teaches virtue. Pain had left the chambers but remained in language. Even the idea of truth carried its echo. That truth must hurt, that honesty must cost, that understanding requires struggle. The machinery of suffering had built a civilization's psychology, and it would take generations to forget. When darkness finally fell, the buildings where truth had been extracted seemed to rest. But the air inside never cooled. It held the faint metallic scent of iron and ink, the ghosts of voices recorded but never heard again. Those rooms taught Europe something it could not unlearn. That truth, like metal, must be tempered in heat. And so the lesson endured, quiet, methodical, endlessly repeating itself in different forms, not always with rope or fire, sometimes with words or guilt or memory. Pain simply changed its vocabulary. As midnight neared, the last candle in the hall burned down to a small blue core. A clerk brushed ash from the table and closed the book. Outside, wind moved softly through empty streets, whispering against doors that would never be opened again. The city slept. The instruments waited. And above it all, unseen, the stars flickered, as if watching but refusing to judge. As Europe drifted into the late Middle Ages, the quiet rooms of interrogation were not enough. The confessions had been written, the heresies burned, the prisons filled. But words on parchment did not reach the crowd. The rulers, both sacred and secular, still needed to be seen keeping order. So the stage grew again, the scaffold returned, and justice, once whispered in cloisters, once murmured in dungeons, now shouted itself to the sky. Public execution became the final sermon of the age. It taught loyalty through fear, obedience through awe. The square was the pulpit, the rope the punctuation. To die publicly was to become a message, written in flesh, read by thousands, remembered by all. Every city had its chosen place. A hill outside the walls, a platform near the gate, or a raised wooden scaffold in the heart of the square. It was never hidden. It stood where the market stood, where trade and talk and laughter usually filled the air. The message was clear. Justice did not need a private audience. It performed in the open daylight, confident and absolute. By dawn, carpenters had already finished their work, boards nailed, ropes tested, guards stationed. Vendors prepared food and drink for the crowd. Children were lifted onto shoulders, and the best spots near the front were taken early. People came not because they were cruel, but because the event was part of life, one of the few occasions that united everyone, beggars, nobles, priests and merchants alike. When the bell began to toll, the murmur of the crowd fell to a low hum. What followed was not chaos, it was choreography. The condemned did not arrive alone. They came surrounded by soldiers, by clerics, by witnesses, sometimes barefoot, sometimes in white, sometimes with a wooden cross hanging around the neck. The crowd parted slowly, as though touched by invisible wind. It was not pity that moved them, but curiosity. Behind the condemned walked a priest, reciting prayers softly, urging confession until the last step. If the prisoner spoke, words of repentance or defiance, the crowd leaned in. They wanted drama. They wanted emotion. A calm death disappointed them. A speech redeemed the event. Trumpets might sound. Flags waved. Even the instruments of execution, the rope, the sword, the pyre, were dressed for the occasion with banners and emblems of the crown. Justice had become theatre, and the state its playwright. To be an executioner was to walk a narrow line between fear and necessity, despised by many, essential to all. They lived apart, often in small houses near the city walls, called only when needed. But on the day of judgment they stepped into the role of ritualist, the final hand of law, the one who turned sentence into silence. They were expected to work cleanly. Too much blood was incompetence. Too little spectacle was disrespect. An executioner who could kill with a single stroke of the sword earned admiration, even pride. Those who botched the task faced the crowd's fury. Stones, curses, sometimes death. To him, the condemned was not an enemy, but a partner in performance. The two shared the same stage for the briefest of moments. One represented guilt, the other order. Both were necessary to keep the world in balance. No one truly understood why they came, yet everyone did. Some out of fear, others from habit, others from a strange reverence for finality. It was a chance to look directly at mortality and to feel, if only for a heartbeat, safer than the person facing it. There was satisfaction in proximity to danger. It reminded people that justice still had a heartbeat, that the law, though distant most days, could still take human form. Parents held children tightly, whispering lessons. This is what happens to those who lie. This is why we obey. The message passed quietly through generations, disguised as education. And when the moment came, the blades fall, the bodies drop, the fires bloom, the crowd exhaled together as if finishing a prayer. Relief, not cruelty, filled the air. The world had been momentarily put back in order. Every detail was symbolic. The turning of the hourglass, the reading of charges, the lifting of hands in blessing. The execution itself lasted seconds, but the ritual around it stretched for hours. It was not enough to kill. Justice had to be felt. Each step of the ritual was designed to slow time, to let fear soak the crowd, to let repentance settle into the condemned. The longer it took, the more sacred it seemed. By the end, when the body was carried away or left hanging as a warning, exhaustion filled the square. It felt like a storm had passed, and peace returned in its wake. Behind the ritual stood power. Kings and councils knew the value of a visible punishment. Every public execution was a kind of speech, a declaration that law reached every citizen, that the state could see and judge all. It was less about one man's guilt and more about everyone else's obedience. The church, too, used the stage. For heretics and witches, the pyre became a sermon. Fire was both punishment and metaphor, the cleansing flame that consumed error and purified the soul. As the smoke rose, people crossed themselves, whispering prayers for the dead and for themselves. The flames flickered against cathedral walls. The air shimmered with heat and incense, and somewhere in the distance bells rang again, solemn, slow, final. When the crowd finally dispersed, the square returned to its usual life. Vendors reopened stalls, children chased each other between stalls, dogs sniffed the ground. By nightfall only ashes or stains remained. But the echo of the event stayed in the air, not as horror, but as reassurance. It was the sound of control, of boundaries reaffirmed. The people did not see themselves as cruel any more than the inquisitors before them had. They saw themselves as witnesses to necessity, participants in a collective ritual of order. Someone had broken the rules. The rules had answered. The world once again made sense, and yet, even in those centuries, there were those who looked away, those who could not bring themselves to watch, who stayed home and listened instead to the bells, the silence that followed, the faint cheer of the crowd carried by the wind. They did not protest, they simply did not look. And perhaps that too was part of how the system survived, not through belief, but through quiet acceptance. When night fell and the scaffold stood empty beneath the moon, its ropes swayed gently in the wind. The wood creaked softly, like a ship at harbour. No one thought of it as cruel. It was just there, waiting, patient, ordinary. Tomorrow the square would fill again with trade and laughter, and above it all the scaffold would remain, silent but certain, a piece of furniture in the house of power. By the 16th century, the public execution had become the heartbeat of justice. It was no longer only punishment, it was communication. A dialogue between ruler and people, played out in the language of spectacle. Every scaffold, every stake, every swinging rope spoke on behalf of the state. The ritual was ancient now, but newly professional. There were rules for how it must unfold, when to ring the bells, how to announce the verdict, how to display the body. No detail was left to chance. Even death had a schedule, and like all performances repeated often enough, it lost its shock. The crowd no longer gasped. They simply watched, murmured, nodded. The rhythm of fear had become part of the city's daily music. The day began long before sunrise. Carpenters arrived first, checking the timbers, testing the rope, sanding splinters from the platform's edge. Guards followed, setting up barriers, clearing the space where thousands would soon gather. Tavern keepers hauled out barrels of ale, vendors unpacked meat pies and bread. The square began to wake, one smell at a time. By dawn the prisoner was led from the cell. Some prayed aloud, some walked in silence. A few smiled, hollow and resigned. They had become part of something larger than themselves, a ritual that had been repeated so many times it no longer felt personal. The city stirred. Windows opened. The crowd gathered layer upon layer, like waves around a single stone, and as the sun rose, it touched the scaffold first, as if the light itself had come to witness what was about to unfold. Every execution began not with cruelty, but with mercy. At least that was how it was presented. The condemned was asked to confess, to forgive his executioner, to pray for the king or the queen, for the church, for the crowd. He was told that a good death could wash away a lifetime of sin. Priests spoke softly, their words rehearsed but sincere. They reminded the onlookers that justice, however grim, was an act of love, that punishment existed to heal, not simply to destroy. The crowd listened, not to the theology, but to the rhythm of the words. The speeches softened fear into familiarity. When the execution came, It felt almost inevitable. This was the genius of ritual. It disguised horror as duty and duty as piety. The blade or the rope seemed to descend from heaven itself, as if every execution were a small echo of divine judgment. Executions were not equal. A noble might be beheaded with sword or axe, a quick, dignified end. A commoner might hang, a heretic might burn. The hierarchy extended even into death. Each form of execution carried meaning. The sword was clean and final, the rope slow and humbling, the fire spiritual and public. The chosen method told the crowd what the state thought of the crime and of the criminal. Kings and queens understood this well. Their justice had to look like mercy. Too much cruelty made them tyrants. Too much leniency made them weak. So each death was calibrated like policy. Enough terror to deter, enough ceremony to sanctify. The burning of heretics and witches was the most dramatic of all. It was both punishment and purification, terror and theatre. The pyre's smoke carried its own sermons. People believed that fire freed the soul from error, that it turned corruption into light. Crowds stood in silence as the flames grew. Some prayed, some watched without emotion. Others turned away, unable to look yet unwilling to leave. The sound was the same each time. The roar of fire, the murmur of prayer, the soft crackle of wood. When it was over, ash drifted through the air like snow. Children gathered fragments of charcoal as relics, believing they held some mysterious power. For days afterward, the smell lingered in the streets, faint but unmistakable. It reminded everyone of the cost of disobedience and of faith. Cities began to build permanent places for death. Execution squares, gallows hills, fields set aside for fire and rope. They were marked on maps, known to all, but visited by few. They gave each town a memory, a point where justice lived. Travellers could recognise a city by the shape of its gallows. Some were simple wooden beams, others great iron structures that creaked in the wind. They stood at the edge of roads, where every passer-by might see. Not hidden, never hidden, because justice had to be visible to exist. At night, these empty frames looked almost peaceful against the moon. The wind swayed their ropes gently, like prayer flags of a grim religion. And though no one was present, the silence still felt inhabited. Fear, once built into wood, does not easily leave. For those who died, their bodies did not always rest. Some were buried at crossroads, others displayed in cages, hung from city gates until bone replaced flesh. The display was not vengeance but message. It said, "This man once defied order. He is gone, and order remains." Birds gathered. Wind stripped away what time had not yet taken. The body became symbol, then warning, then finally memory. And memory was what mattered most. The dead were forgotten as people, but remembered as lessons. They became part of the invisible wall that kept society in place. By the 17th century, the executions had multiplied. The crowds came still, but their mood had changed. There was less reverence now, more boredom. Punishment had become spectacle without meaning, ritual without faith. Vendors sold souvenirs, musicians played during hangings, criminals recited poems or sang as they died. Some treated the scaffold as a stage for final fame. Others used their last words to accuse their accusers, turning the performance against its own script. The state began to sense danger in this familiarity. If people grew too comfortable with death, fear would lose its power. And so, slowly, quietly, the scaffolds began to move again. away from the market, behind walls, into courtyards. Punishment was going private once more. When night came and the square emptied, the scaffold stood in moonlight like a monument, its boards darkened by rain, its rope stiff with age. For years it would stand untouched until the next body called it back to life. Above it the stars burned with their usual indifference, the same stars that watched over kings and prisoners alike, over cities that killed to keep the peace, and over the silence that followed them. And beneath that silence, the lesson still pulsed quietly through every heart. That power, to be believed, must sometimes be cruel, and that cruelty, to be forgiven, must look holy. The 17th and 18th centuries opened with a strange contradiction. Cities were larger, knowledge deeper, faith more uncertain, yet the scaffold still stood in every square. The world was changing, but the instruments of fear had not yet learned how to vanish. People no longer gathered from devotion. They came out of habit, curiosity, boredom. Executions had become civic entertainment, part of the weekly rhythm like markets or fairs. Children laughed, vendors shouted, soldiers dozed. The lesson that once terrified had become background noise, and when fear turns familiar, it begins to lose its power. By day, philosophers wrote of liberty and rights. By night, the same cities lit fires under the condemned. Europe lived in 2 centuries at once, the age of enlightenment and the age of spectacle. But one of them was beginning to tire. The scaffold, that wooden stage of centuries, looked smaller now against the rising skyline of glass and stone. Its language, blood, smoke, and ritual, no longer matched the new grammar of progress. Doctors, writers, and scholars began to ask, if justice was meant to heal society, why did it still look like illness? The questions spread quietly, like cracks beneath marble. They were not yet rebellion, only fatigue. But fatigue can topple any monument if it lasts long enough. The new thinkers spoke of the mind rather than the body. They claimed that fear could reform behaviour more effectively than pain, that education could replace terror, that order might survive without cruelty. Pamphlets circulated through cafes and drawing rooms, their pages trembling in candlelight. They described punishments as relics of a darker time, necessary once, barbaric now. The crowd began to agree, not from pity, but from pride. It wanted to see itself as civilized. Reform, at first, was cosmetic. Executions were shortened, torture restricted, the scaffolds cleaned. But beneath those gestures lay a deeper shift. People no longer wanted to see punishment. They wanted it to happen somewhere else, quietly, out of sight. And so, gradually the theatre closed. Gallows were moved to courtyards, prisons expanded, trials went indoors. The crowd was dismissed. Justice became an affair between state and prisoner, unseen by those it claimed to protect. What began as mercy also served control. Private punishment was easier to manage, easier to forget. The state no longer needed public awe. It needed efficiency. The scaffold was replaced by the cell, the spectacle by the schedule. To most citizens this seemed progress. To others it felt like silence swallowing history. They missed the ceremony, the collective certainty, even the fear. For all its horror, the old world had at least been visible. In place of the scaffold rose the prison, tall, cold, geometric. Its walls were thicker than the gallows were high. Its windows were few, narrow, and placed not for light but for discipline. inside, punishment changed its rhythm. Time replaced pain. Days became the new measure of justice. Where once the condemned had died before thousands, now they lived unseen, counted by hours instead of wounds. The body, at last, was spared, but the mind was captured. Order no longer relied on spectacle, it relied on isolation. Solitude replaced fire, routine replaced rope. The age of noise had given way to the age of silence. Public cruelty had embarrassed the modern world. The same people who dissected nature and mapped the stars could not bear to admit that they still gathered to watch men die. Reformers spoke not only of justice but of dignity. To punish in private was to respect the criminal's humanity, or so they said. But privacy had another purpose: forgetfulness. When suffering happens unseen, it stops being shared. The crowd no longer learns fear from the body of the condemned. It learns obedience from absence. Silence becomes the new instrument of control. And so, paradoxically, the disappearance of pain made it easier to sustain. The system no longer needed applause, it only needed paperwork. Even so, the last public executions lingered like ghosts. In London, Paris, Vienna, crowds still gathered one more time, as if saying farewell to an old religion. They watched not with reverence, but with a kind of melancholy. The gallows, soon to be dismantled, felt almost like a relic, a piece of history ending before their eyes. When the final rope swung, there was no cheer, only the murmur of departure, the sound of feet on cobblestone. People spoke quietly on their way home, unsure whether they had witnessed justice or nostalgia. By morning, the scaffold was already being taken apart. The boards stacked, the nails bent, the ground swept clean. Nothing remained except memory, and the faint, uneasy feeling that something immense had ended. Though the executions ceased, their memory shaped everything that came after. Prisons borrowed the architecture of the stage, surveillance replacing spectacle, observation replacing awe. The old logic endured in a new form. If people cannot watch punishment, punishment must watch them. The state no longer shouted, it whispered. Its gaze was constant but quiet, its justice mechanical, unannounced. The scaffold had vanished, but its shadow stretched across every courthouse, every cell, every rule. And the crowd, now dismissed from its role, carried the memory in silence. It had learned, over centuries, that order is a kind of theatre, and that even when the curtain falls, the play continues. When dusk fell over these newly civilized cities, the squares where justice had once spoken were filled again with markets and laughter. The air smelled of bread instead of smoke. Children played where bodies once hung. The world looked clean, brighter, modern. But beneath the stone, under centuries of footsteps, the ground still remembered. And if one stood there in silence long enough, one might almost hear the echo, the faint hum of a crowd holding its breath, the sound of a rope pulled taut, the whisper that the play had never really ended, only moved indoors. By the dawn of the 19th century, the scaffold was almost gone. The world that had once gathered in awe to see a man die had turned inward. Cities were too crowded, minds too restless to stand still and watch. Justice had followed the same path as faith, from public ritual to private conscience. The crowd was dismissed, the square was cleaned, and the last remnants of the old spectacle slipped quietly into memory. The new age called itself humane. It spoke of dignity, of progress, of reform. But beneath those words lay a simpler truth. The modern mind had grown uncomfortable with seeing what it demanded others to suffer, so punishment learned to whisper. It traded fire for walls, rope for doors that locked from the outside. What once burned in daylight now rotted in shadow. Execution still happened, but behind stone and iron. No crowd, no sermon, no lesson, just a name on paper, a time on a schedule, a record filed and forgotten. Death became administrative, justice became clerical, and cruelty, stripped of its noise, became efficient. Factories, railways, and machines reshaped the earth, and the prison followed their example. Rows of cells lined like gears, each numbered, each occupied by a body counted as both sinner and resource. Work became part of sentence, silence part of obedience. The prison was not chaos, it was symmetry. Every wall straight, every corridor aligned, every hour accounted for. It was the new perfection, a punishment so organized it no longer looked like punishment at all. Architects called these designs panopticons, circles of cells watched from a single point at the centre. No one knew when they were being observed, and so they behaved as if they always were. The eyes of the crowd had been replaced by the single invisible gaze of the state, and in that quiet, unseen observation, fear learned a new form. Society congratulated itself. It had abolished the barbarity of public death, but what it had really done was change where it placed the cruelty. Instead of outside, it was inside. Instead of a moment, it was a lifetime. The condemned no longer bled. They waited. They woke and slept beneath the same ceiling, counting time like drops of water. Their punishment was duration itself. The new moralists said this was progress. The body was no longer tortured, the soul was reformed. But in truth, it was simply a new kind of erasure. A body that suffers unseen is easier to forget, and a cruelty that hides behind kindness survives longer. The people who once filled the squares had found new forms of spectacle. Theatres, newspapers, pamphlets. These became the new scaffolds of imagination. The same hunger for drama, confession and guilt lived on, but transferred to fiction. Now the public watched tragedies on stage instead of in the street. They wept for actors instead of prisoners. And the moral comfort remained. They were still witnesses to suffering, only at a safer distance. Even literature learned the rhythm of punishment. Every novel a trial, every ending a verdict. Stories replaced executions as society's way of cleansing itself through empathy and control. The spectacle had not died. It had been domesticated. In some places, the old gallows were left standing for years, forgotten and decaying. Grass grew around their posts, birds nested on their beams. Children played near them, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had been consecrated by centuries of fear. Old men still pointed to those spots. There, they would say, was where justice lived. But even their voices grew uncertain. Had it really been justice, or simply habit? Had the world improved, or had it just learned to hide its violence better? These were not questions for public debate. They lived quietly in the margins of thought, like dust in sunlight, seen only when light passed through at the right angle. What began in the square found new stages in offices and institutions, hospitals, schools, factories. Each borrowed the logic of the old rituals: observation, correction, routine. The same choreography, stripped of rope and flame, performed now with paperwork and time. People no longer feared execution, they feared failure. They no longer confessed to priests, they confessed to supervisors, inspectors, doctors. Punishment had not vanished. It had multiplied, invisibly, and yet people believed themselves freer than ever. They had forgotten that freedom too can be a performance. The new order didn't shout. It whispered in polite language, in schedules, in systems. It didn't burn the body. It shaped behaviour. It smiled. It promised safety. It thanked you for your cooperation. The cruelty of the old world was easy to see and condemn. The cruelty of the new world was quiet, persuasive, invisible. And because it spoke the language of kindness, few dared to call it cruelty at all. The last public executions came like echoes, distant, uncertain, almost embarrassed. In the few cities that still held them, the crowds arrived out of curiosity more than faith. They no longer believed in the old moral theatre. They were there only to witness its final curtain. When the blade fell, or the rope tightened, the silence that followed was not awe, but relief. People turned away quickly. No one cheered. They wanted to leave the place as though walking out of an outdated play. By the next morning the scaffold was dismantled for good. The boards used for new buildings, the nails sold for scrap. The earth beneath it was levelled, paved, forgotten. But the shadow remained, not in wood or rope, but in memory, in the way cities still organize themselves, in the way laws still assume obedience, in the quiet certainty that order always requires someone to suffer. When dusk fell on this new, enlightened world, the streets glowed with oil lamps and early gaslight. The same streets where once the crowd had gathered now held only footsteps and conversation. The air was cleaner, the walls higher, the voices softer. It all looked peaceful, almost innocent. But the peace was not freedom. It was discipline wearing a gentler face. And if one listened closely, under the hum of progress and the rhythm of industry, one could still hear something faint. The ghost of a crowd holding its breath. The whisper of a rope in wind. The echo of a world that believed for far too long that to control was to cleanse. When the scaffold disappeared from the squares, it did not take punishment with it. It simply changed its address. What had once unfolded in the open air now happened behind walls, in the still corridors of prisons, where silence replaced spectacle. The world had grown ashamed of its cruelty, but not ready to abandon it. It merely rephrased it. Pain became discipline. Death became reform. And in that translation, a new kind of punishment was born. Colder, quieter, endless. This was the age when society learned to build not just prisons for the body, but prisons for the mind. The prison was designed not as chaos, but as geometry. Long corridors, identical cells, perfect symmetry. Every line pointed toward control. It was the architect's version of morality. Balance, proportion, surveillance. The building itself was a sermon in stone. Its walls did not shout, but they never stopped speaking. Inside, every movement was counted. When to wake, when to eat, when to walk, when to sleep. Freedom was divided into hours, and each hour into rules. A prisoner didn't lose his life. He lost the right to decide what it meant. The body no longer screamed. It waited. And in the waiting, a deeper kind of suffering began. The kind that does not end when the day does. Time became the new instrument of pain. The whip had left marks, the clock left none. It punished through repetition. The same steps, the same meals, the same silence, day after day. The clock taught obedience better than any overseer. It demanded not submission through force, but through rhythm. The prisoner's body began to move in time with the schedule. until even his heartbeat seemed to match the bells. Order had entered the flesh. Punishment no longer needed violence. It had become mechanical. The New Age spoke the language of reason. Where faith had once ruled, now psychology and philosophy took its place. They claimed that a man could be repaired, that punishment properly measured could rebuild character. Prisons became laboratories of morality, each inmate a subject, each behaviour recorded, classified, adjusted. The goal was no longer to destroy evil, but to redesign it. The old torturer had asked, "What do you believe?" The new reformer asked, "Why did you disobey?" The first demanded confession, the second demanded explanation. But both wanted control. Only the vocabulary had changed. To reform meant to reshape. The prisoner was taught new habits, how to walk, how to speak, how to think before acting. Silence was the first lesson, obedience the second, reflection the third. Each cell held a small window, high and unreachable. Light entered at the same angle every morning, then faded by evening. It was not meant for comfort, it was meant to remind. The prisoner could see the sky, but never reach it. Guards called this design humane. Philosophers called it moral. But to those who lived inside, it was a slow erasure of self, the transformation of a person into a pattern. The greatest invention of the prison was not the lock or the wall, it was guilt. The new system did not need to beat the body when it could persuade the soul to do it instead. Every sermon, every inspection, every moment of solitude told the same story. You are responsible for yourself. It sounded noble, even kind, but it turned punishment inward. The prisoner became both captive and warden, sinner and judge. Shame replaced chains, reflection replaced pain. And it worked. The body may resist, but the mind, when convinced it deserves suffering, becomes its own jailer. The English philosopher Jeremy Bentham imagined the perfect prison, a circle of cells around a single tower, each inmate visible to a guard who might or might not be watching. The brilliance of the design was its uncertainty. Because no one knew when they were observed, everyone behaved as if they always were. The architecture eliminated the need for constant supervision. Surveillance became self-sustaining. The gaze moved from the guard's eye into the prisoner's imagination. Power had learned invisibility. The panopticon was never fully built as Bentham envisioned it, but its logic spread everywhere. Schools, hospitals, factories, even families began to organize around its idea. Control through visibility, discipline through possibility. The world had become a network of silent watchtowers. Each day inside the prison followed a rhythm so steady it felt eternal. Wake at dawn, work in silence, pray, eat, return to the cell, sleep, repeat. This repetition, reformers said, would teach patience, humility, and moral strength. They called it virtue. But the rhythm served another purpose, predictability. A predictable person is easier to control. Freedom, they argued, had made men reckless. Routine would make them good, and so, goodness became another word for compliance. Outside the walls, the world congratulated itself. The days of fire and spectacle were over. Justice was clean now, rational, private. But privacy was not compassion. It was convenience. The citizens no longer had to face what was done in their name. The suffering that had once united the crowd now happened invisibly, leaving no sound, no smoke, no memory. The old punishments had been cruel, but at least they were shared. The new ones were lonely, and loneliness, the reformers discovered, lasted longer than pain. By the mid-19th century, punishment had finally changed its story. The goal was no longer vengeance or order, but redemption. Each prison claimed to turn sinners into citizens. Every sentence had a moral beneath its legal one. But redemption too could be weaponized. If a man left prison still poor, still voiceless, still obedient, had he truly been reformed, or merely reshaped to fit society's mould? The new justice asked men to heal from the very system that had wounded them. It was a softer cruelty, but a deeper one. When night settled over, the prison, its lights remained on, small squares of yellow in the dark glowing like eyes. From above the city looked peaceful, its towers quiet, its streets empty. But hidden within that stillness, thousands of minds turned restlessly in their beds, learning what obedience felt like in silence. The scaffold had fallen, the whip had gone quiet, but punishment had never left. It had only learned to whisper. As the 19th century deepened, the prison ceased to be an institution of punishment and became something more abstract, a symbol of civilization itself. Every country built them, every city funded them, every generation justified them. They were not merely places, they were mirrors, showing society what it feared most: chaos, idleness, disobedience. But as the walls multiplied, something unexpected began to happen. The logic of the prison, its silence, its surveillance, its order, began to seep beyond its gates. It entered the school, the factory, the home. The techniques of discipline became the grammar of modern life. The world outside started to look very much like the world inside. The same rhythm that once shaped the prisoner's day soon organized everyone else's. The ringing bell of the classroom echoed the prison's wake-up call. The factory whistle replaced the guard's command. The office clock ticked with the same authority as the prison schedule. Workers signed in and out. Students stood when spoken to. Citizens filled forms, stood in lines, obeyed signs. Each rule seemed harmless on its own, but together they built a quiet architecture of obedience. What had once been called correction was now called order. And in this new order, everyone was both observer and observed. The greatest success of the prison was not that it confined bodies, but that it convinced people to confine themselves. Guilt had become habitual, not just for crimes, but for failure, laziness, doubt. To feel guilty was to feel civilized. To question authority was to feel wrong. And so, the line between punishment and normal life blurred. The prison no longer needed walls when minds had learned to police themselves. People internalized the gaze of power, the invisible watcher from Bentham's tower, until even in solitude they felt observed. They called it conscience. But conscience, once a voice of morality, had become an echo of surveillance. Reformers spoke endlessly of solitude. They claimed it was medicine for the soul, that by removing distractions, by silencing the noise of others, a man could face himself and find redemption. But solitude is a mirror, not a cure, and those who looked into it for too long began to dissolve into reflection. Days folded into one another. Dreams replaced time. The self, starved of contact, began to fade. The reformers called this repentance. The prisoners called it madness. In that quiet, they began to learn a strange truth, that isolation does not cleanse. It only makes the dirt invisible. Outside, people were learning the same lesson without realizing it. Cities demanded punctuality, Governments demanded paperwork. Families demanded propriety. Life had become one long rehearsal for acceptance. Discipline had replaced faith as the glue of society. People no longer prayed for forgiveness. They scheduled it. They measured their worth by productivity, not purity. And in this new arithmetic, time itself became currency. The old punishments had demanded pain. The new world demanded performance. Both sought control, but only one required your cooperation. Even after Bentham's panopticon faded into theory, its spirit endured. The idea that someone, somewhere, might be watching, not constantly but possibly, was enough. It changed behaviour without needing force. That idea spread far beyond prisons. It found its way into factories, where overseers stood at raised platforms, into offices, where managers checked clocks and signatures, into classrooms, where students learned early that every action might be graded. It even entered religion anew, not as God above, but as guilt within. The eye that once watched from heaven now lived behind the forehead, quiet and constant. And that perhaps was the most successful invention of the prison, a watcher that no longer needed walls or windows to exist. Reformers believed they had humanized justice. They said the new system taught responsibility, self-control, morality. They said it turned criminals into citizens. But education too can become punishment when it is forced. Prisoners learned obedience by rote, memorizing virtues the way a student memorizes scripture. Work hard, be silent, respect authority. These lessons, repeated daily, began to sound less like wisdom and more like hypnosis. And when prisoners were finally released, they carried those lessons with them, the rhythm of obedience embedded deep within. Society welcomed them back not as redeemed men, but as proof that the system worked. By the late 19th century, reformers toured prisons proudly. They admired the clean cells, the measured routines, the efficiency of order. Gone were the screams, the fire, the spectacle. In their place, paperwork, silence, calm. It looked humane, even enlightened, but the calm was deceptive. The suffering had not stopped. It had simply been disciplined. Pain was no longer visible because it had become normal, and normality, once established, rarely needs to justify itself. The reformers had built a world so tidy that even cruelty seemed rational. By the dawn of the 20th century, the prison had completed its transformation. It was no longer a building at the edge of town. It was an idea distributed across everything. Governments learned to watch without touching. Institutions learned to punish without anger. People learned to obey without noticing. The same principles that governed a single cell now governed entire populations. Statistics replaced chains. Identification replaced confession. Order became invisible but total. And the greatest irony was this. The world that had condemned the medieval scaffold for its brutality had perfected a system far more efficient, a cruelty so smooth it no longer felt cruel. When night fell on the industrial cities, their prisons glowed softly at the outskirts, quiet, fortresses of light among fields of darkness. Inside, thousands of men slept in perfect alignment, their breaths synchronized like the ticking of clocks. And far beyond those walls, in homes and offices, others did the same, each following unseen schedules, each obeying invisible bells. The scaffold had been torn down, the dungeon abandoned, but the dream of control, steady, silent, endless, had survived them all. By the early 20th century, the walls of the prison no longer marked the edge of control. They had become the model for it. The same structure, observation, record-keeping, correction, spread outward until the whole world resembled a vast, open institution. The prison had taught the state how to see. Now the state would teach society how to be seen. Governments learned to collect information as the church had once collected confessions. Files replaced sermons. Census forms replaced penance. And obedience, once enforced by fear, was now achieved through paperwork. Surveillance had become moral, a duty, a civic virtue. To be watched was to be part of the system. To disappear from view was to become suspicious. The modern state was built not on stone, but on documents. Every life became a sequence of entries: birth, address, tax, occupation, crime, death. The body was no longer marked by rope or brand. It was marked by number. To exist was to be documented. Identity became paperwork. Citizenship became data. And bureaucracy, once a tool of administration, became a theology of its own, a belief that what could be recorded could be controlled. In dusty offices filled with carbon paper and ink, the new priests of order, clerks, registrars, inspectors, quietly replaced the inquisitors of old. They did not question the soul, they questioned the form, and through these forms entire populations learned the rhythm of submission. Sign here, wait there, follow procedure. No one feared the state's gaze anymore. They depended on it. Names had always mattered, but now they were not enough. The modern world demanded precision. Fingerprints, photographs, documents, proof upon proof that you were who you claimed to be. The passport replaced the pilgrim's relic. The identification card replaced the oath. Every border became a confessional booth where one proved their existence to a silent authority. It was not about safety. It was about certainty. The state could not trust memory, so it invented identity. The body was measured, classified, indexed, not to harm it, but to understand it completely. And in that understanding, control found its perfection. The beauty of surveillance was its politeness. It didn't threaten, it requested. It didn't command, it reminded. It smiled through posters and paperwork promising protection while quietly extending its reach. Tell us where you live. Tell us what you earn. Tell us what you believe. The question sounded harmless, even helpful. But every answer built another wall around freedom. The citizen filled out the form and called it participation. The state collected the form and called it peace. Neither realized how much had already been exchanged. New technologies gave the state new eyes. Cameras, telegraphs, telephones, typewriters. Each invention widened the reach of control. The watcher no longer stood in the tower. He sat behind a desk. Distance made observation clean, detached, professional. From the air the city looked organized. From the archive the people looked manageable. Only from the ground, from the human level, did the system's weight become visible, and yet most accepted it. To be monitored was no longer humiliation, it was reassurance. It meant you mattered enough to be counted. It meant you belonged. As centuries turned, the word order began to fade from the vocabulary of power. Its replacement was softer. Security. Security sounded benevolent, even comforting. It was not the whip or the pyre, it was the promise of safety. But safety requires danger to justify it. So the state, without realizing it, began to invent new forms of fear, enemies, threats, crises. to keep its machinery alive. Every new danger gave birth to another method of control: permits, checkpoints, surveillance networks, intelligence bureaus. Each innovation claimed necessity. Each reduced freedom by an inch, and no one noticed, because the trade was gradual and polite. The old punishments had been brutal but honest. The new ones were invisible but endless. By mid-century, entire nations had learned the language of watching. The police kept files, the post office read letters, the census tracked families, the schools measured minds. The state no longer needed to act. Its citizens watched one another willingly. Suspicion became civic duty. Neighbours reported neighbours, students reported teachers, employees reported co-workers. The gaze of authority had multiplied, scattered across every street, every home. And the most effective form of surveillance was not the camera or the file. It was fear disguised as responsibility. The modern world prided itself on freedom, yet built walls more intricate than any dungeon. They were not made of iron but of expectation. To live meant to comply, to be punctual, polite, predictable. Freedom was measured by how well one fit the pattern. No one forced the citizen to obey. They simply taught him to want to. He obeyed not out of fear, but habit. The cage was internal, built from comfort, convenience, and the quiet desire not to be noticed. And because it was invisible, it was never questioned. In time, even rebellion was absorbed. Movements that rose against the state were catalogued, studied, and filed like any other behaviour. Control no longer fought resistance, it recorded it. The protester's photo, the dissident's words, the exile's passport, all became part of the same archive. Revolt had once been an act of defiance. Now it was another entry in a system that measured everything. Power had become reflexive. It saw itself, recorded itself, perpetuated itself. The machine no longer needed to justify existence. It existed because it could see. And in that endless vision, the individual disappeared. When night settled over the modern city, light glowed from every window, every lamp, every office tower. It looked peaceful from a distance, beautiful, even holy. But each light marked a point of observation, a record being written, a presence being confirmed. The darkness between those lights had grown narrow. There were fewer places left to be unseen. And in that endless glow of progress, humanity had finally achieved what the Inquisition, the scaffold and the prison could only dream of: a world where everyone was obedient, not because they were forced to be, but because they no longer remembered how not to be. By the middle of the 20th century, the dream of perfect visibility had become reality. Every government office, every factory floor, every border crossing pulsed with the same rhythm of record and report. Files multiplied faster than people could read them. Cabinets filled, archives deepened. Whole buildings became organs of memory, not human memory, but administrative memory. The modern state did not think in emotions, it thought in documents. And like all minds that forget to feel, it became efficient beyond measure. The old world had believed in the soul. The new world believed in the file. Each person was an entry: birth certificate, passport, license, tax return, death record, a full life reduced to paper, stamped and numbered. The file never slept. It outlived its subject, accumulating not dust but authority. A man might die, but his records remained, circling through offices, being copied, quoted, and referenced. In a strange inversion of faith, The paperwork became immortal while the person vanished. This state no longer feared the invisible heretic, it feared the undocumented citizen. To be unrecorded was to be untrusted, to live outside the light of the archive. Wars taught the world how to watch faster. Telegraphs gave way to radios, radios to satellites, satellites to computers. Every new technology promised connection, and with it came the shadow of observation. During the great conflicts, nations learned to listen to everything. Whispers, signals, breaths between words. The war ended, but the machinery stayed. The need to know had become a habit, and habits outlast fear. The Secret Service replaced the confessional. Information replaced repentance. Truth no longer set men free. It classified them. And yet, it was all spoken in the language of safety. To be watched was to be protected. To be hidden was to be dangerous. The paradox was complete. The world feared invisibility more than it feared control. When computers arrived, they did not break the system. They completed it. What once took rooms of clerks could now be done in seconds by circuits. Data became infinite, and with it, surveillance effortless. The machine did not care who was guilty. It cared only that everything was known. It gathered without judgment, stored without feeling, processed without pause. Its silence felt clean, almost merciful. No torture, no fire, no shouting. Just numbers. Pure, indifferent, permanent. The New Age called this progress, but it was progress in the same way a locked door is an improvement over a broken one. Secure, efficient, final. The modern Inquisition no longer needed dungeons. It lived in databases and security cameras, in search engines and transaction logs. The questions it asked were quieter but constant. Where are you? What do you want? Who are you speaking to? How long did you stay? Every answer added another pixel to the portrait, and soon the portrait knew more about you than you knew, about yourself. Unlike its medieval ancestors, this Inquisition had no anger. It smiled. It suggested. It optimized. Its goal was not repentance, but prediction. The heretic was no longer the unbeliever. It was the unpredictable. People no longer resisted the gaze. They welcomed it. Cameras made them feel safer. Forms made them feel included. They traded privacy for convenience, and convenience became its own theology. They documented themselves voluntarily. Names, faces, thoughts, feelings, all offered freely to unseen systems. It did not feel like surrender. It felt like participation. Every click, every post, every movement was a prayer to the new order, not to be forgiven, but to be recognized. To exist was to appear, and to appear was to belong. The watchtower no longer stood above them. It lived in their hands. By the 21st century, surveillance had become ambient. It required no guards, no threats, no commands. It was woven into the air. The glow of screens, the hum of routers, the quiet pulse of satellites passing overhead. Every street was mapped, every purchase remembered, every voice, somewhere, recorded. The system had achieved its dream, not omnipotence, but omnipresence. No one ordered obedience anymore. It happened automatically, through habits and settings and the gentle suggestion of algorithms. And so, after centuries of noise, punishment had finally become silent, a seamless blend of freedom and control. In this new world, transparency became virtue. To hide was suspicious. To reveal was moral. People learned to confess without being asked, to share everything, to curate themselves. The public square, once a place of punishment, was reborn as the digital stage, and once again the crowd returned, not to watch executions, but to witness confessions, every scandal, every apology, every outburst, modern rituals of exposure, performed to the applause or outrage of millions. The technology had changed, but the instinct was ancient. Society still needed its spectacles. It still needed to see someone fall to believe itself upright. Somewhere along the line, secrecy became sin. People began to apologize for privacy, to justify solitude, to feel guilt for silence. The self became public property, an open document for others to edit, judge, and approve. In the name of connection, humanity returned to its oldest comfort, confession. Only this time the priest was a network, the altar a screen, and the penance endless attention. It was the final echo of the Inquisition, a civilization that had made peace with being watched. When night fell over the glowing cities of the modern world, every window shone with the same cold light. Inside each room, a person sat before a screen, reflected faintly in its glass. The watcher and the watched merged at last. There were no guards, no gallows, no cries, only light, everywhere, always on, and the quiet certainty that the story, after all, this time had never really changed, only the tools had. By the turn of the 21st century, the great project of control had found its purest language, data. Where earlier ages had ruled through pain and later ones through paperwork, this new era ruled through numbers, invisible, weightless, absolute. Every gesture, every purchase, every moment of curiosity left a trace. Billions of traces merging and splitting like rivers, feeding into vast unseen oceans of information. And in those oceans, power learned to swim. The human story, once written in ink and confession, was now written in code. It no longer needed permission to know you. It simply listened. The world had never felt lighter. Messages crossed continents in seconds. Photographs replaced memory, and machines answered faster than thought. It all seemed effortless, and because it felt effortless, few asked what was being exchanged. The price of speed was permanence. Nothing truly disappeared anymore. Each word, each image, each pause between clicks was stored somewhere, waiting to be connected to something else. The past had become searchable. Forgetfulness, once a mercy, had turned obsolete. In this new economy, the most valuable resource was not oil or gold. It was attention. The human being, once citizen and believer, had become product and profile. Companies built mirrors so precise that people began to see themselves through algorithms. Your preferences, your fears, your desires, all translated into patterns that could be predicted, bought, and sold. The marketplace had always studied desire. Now it could measure it. And once desire can be measured, it can be guided. Advertising became prophecy. Recommendation became command. The system did not punish. It persuaded. Freedom was no longer taken away. It was redesigned so you would not notice when you stopped using it. Once, privacy had meant a door, a wall, a curtain, something physical, something solid. Now it meant settings, toggles, boxes, permissions, a simulation of choice built inside the very system that erased it. The idea of privacy survived only as nostalgia, like a photograph of an empty room. People still used the word, but they meant something else, the right to be seen on their own terms. The concept had flipped completely. To be unseen was not freedom anymore. It was invisibility, irrelevance. So people volunteered to be watched, hoping that the gaze might give them value. Every post was a small confession, every like a prayer for approval. The digital world did not need to demand obedience. It only needed to reward visibility. And so, the ancient rhythm continued. Exposure, judgment, forgiveness, repeat. The medieval square had returned, only brighter and quieter. The gallows had become a comment section. The crowd had become infinite, and the spectacle, as always, was us. People lived inside an endless reflection, one part actor, one part audience. They called it connection, but it often felt like surveillance. Wearing a smile, the genius of the new order was that it never needed to ask twice. It whispered through terms and conditions, long, dull, unreadable hymns to legality. And by clicking agree, the modern soul confessed again. The Inquisition had used faith. The Empire had used fear. The modern system used fatigue. It exhausted resistance until obedience felt like relief. And so, the invisible contract of surveillance was renewed daily, not through force, but through convenience. There was a strange sweetness to it all, maps that spoke, devices that remembered, voices that answered. The world had never felt more attentive, but the attention was not love. It was logistics. The system did not care who you were, only that you were. Every question you asked, every step you took made the map sharper. Each act of curiosity fed the machine that claimed to serve you, and yet the convenience was irresistible. People wanted to be known, even if it meant being owned. Secrets had once given shape to intimacy, the quiet boundary between self and world. Now secrecy looked suspicious. The unposted moment, the unshared thought, the unrecorded day, each felt like a kind of absence. People began to narrate their lives in real time, afraid that silence might make them invisible. They no longer lived to remember, they lived to be remembered. Each image, each update, another small defense against being forgotten. But memory without forgetting is not remembrance. It is surveillance with nostalgia. In this new order, time itself began to flatten. There was no past to leave behind, no future to prepare for, only the endless now of scrolling and refresh. Every moment was equally loud, equally brief, equally forgotten. The system did not need to erase history. It drowned it in immediacy. Attention became the shortest form of existence, and in that endless present, people lost the sense that anything could ever truly end. When night fell on the cities of glass and signal, the glow of billions of screens lit the horizon like a second dawn. Each screen a candle, each click a whisper of faith in the same invisible God. A God that promised knowledge but offered only reflection. And above that glow, the sky looked darker than ever, not because light had vanished, but because there was too much of it to see the stars. By the middle of the 21st century, the world had become transparent. Every surface glowed, every device listened, every action was stored. What had once been called technology was now simply atmosphere, an invisible fabric that wrapped itself around every life. The dream of visibility was complete, and yet no one felt entirely seen. People lived in the open, but still searched for eyes that truly looked back. They had traded privacy for connection, and found themselves lonelier than before. Attention had become a form of oxygen. Without it, the modern person began to suffocate, not physically, but existentially. Unnoticed lives felt smaller, unreal. Every gesture carried a faint hope of being observed. Even solitude became performative. A photo of a sunset captioned peace. The private moment survived only if it could be shared. It was not vanity that drove this hunger, it was reassurance. To be witnessed was to exist. To be unseen was to fade. And so, people fed the network what it desired most, themselves. The watcher was no longer human. It did not blink, it did not sleep, it did not forget. It learned, patiently, endlessly, until it knew the shape of your curiosity better than you did. It predicted what you might want, what you might fear, what you might buy, who you might love. It didn't guess, it calculated. And the more it learned, the more invisible it became. It did not need to command or correct. It only needed to suggest. The suggestion was enough. People believed they were choosing. They did not realize how narrow the choice had become. The algorithm was polite, generous, always helpful. But behind its kindness, it was doing what power has always done, deciding what deserved to be seen. The old world had built walls to keep power out. The new world built windows and called them freedom. Governments and corporations no longer needed to spy. Citizens volunteered their secrets daily. They documented their meals, their moods, their locations, their fears. Each fragment of identity folded neatly into the digital economy. Privacy had become not a right, but a privilege, one that only a few could afford. To opt out was to disappear, and disappearance was the only true rebellion left. But the system had made rebellion inconvenient. Without data, one could not travel, not buy, not belong. The price of freedom was isolation, and few could pay it. People told themselves they were in control. They could delete, block, restrict, unsubscribe. They could choose what to share, when to speak, what to hide. But control is a feeling, not a fact. The system did not need their full consent, only their participation. Every movement, every silence, every hesitation still produced information. Even refusal became data. And so the illusion of freedom continued to feed the machinery of control. It was no longer tyranny, it was interactivity. Once, a man's thoughts were his own. Now, even thought had a shadow. Search histories, conversation logs, predictive text whispering the next word before it was spoken. The interior world, the quiet space where doubt, imagination and prayer once lived, began to shrink. Each unexpressed thought felt incomplete, almost wasteful, if not shared. And so, the sacred act of reflection was replaced by the public act of expression. The self was no longer a mystery to be discovered. It was a performance to be maintained. The world had become a mirror maze. Infinite reflections, no depth. The old gods had promised eternity through faith. The new system promised it through storage. Every photograph, every word, every location preserved. Not because it mattered, but because it could be. The archive had no hierarchy, no meaning. It kept everything. It forgave nothing. And in that total memory, meaning dissolved. When everything is remembered, nothing stands out. When nothing is forgotten, time loses shape. The world had achieved immortality by forgetting what it means to live. Once again, the crowd gathered, not in squares, but in feeds. Their noise was constant, rhythmic, endless. Every moment contained 1,000 witnesses and no memory. The modern spectacle was bloodless, but no less hungry. Outrage replaced execution. Virality replaced fire. The guilty were not burned. They were exposed. The punishment was not pain. It was attention. The crowd cheered as it always had, believing it was defending morality, not realizing it was still performing obedience. The stage had changed. the ritual had not. There came a point when no one could remember when surveillance had started, or when it had stopped feeling like surveillance. It had merged with daily life, woven into the texture of convenience so tightly that to remove it would feel like tearing the world itself apart. People stopped asking if they were being watched and began to ask why it mattered. The answer, whispered by the glowing devices that filled every home, was always the same: because you asked us to, and perhaps that was true. Control no longer needed force, only consent disguised as comfort. When night fell over the cities of light, the glow never faded. It hummed softly, endlessly, as though the entire planet had become one vast sleepless machine, dreaming in data. Inside each home, the screens dimmed but did not turn off. The watchers rested. The watched scrolled. And somewhere in the hum of electricity, the boundary between them disappeared completely. By the middle of the 21st century, humanity had never been more connected. Signals crossed oceans faster than thoughts. Voices travelled without bodies, faces without breath, words without silence. The dream of communication was complete, and yet, everywhere, the quiet ache of loneliness deepened. Connection had replaced companionship. People spoke constantly, but few were ever heard. Every message was answered, but rarely understood. The world was full of conversation, but empty of conversation's warmth. The crowd had followed everyone home. It lived in the palm of the hand, glowing softly, whispering endlessly. The street, the cafe, the bedroom, all contained the same invisible audience. Alone no longer meant private. It meant scrolling through 1,000 lives that never paused long enough to notice yours. Each image was proof that someone else existed more vividly. Each silence, a reminder that you did not. The crowd no longer gathered to punish or pray. It gathered simply to be there. Millions of eyes watching everything, remembering nothing. Touch had once been language. It carried comfort, apology, belonging. Now it felt almost obsolete. Work happened through screens, affection through messages, grief through icons. The hand that once reached across a table now hovered over glass. Skin had become metaphor. Warmth had been replaced by glow. No one intended this. It arrived quietly, one convenience at a time, until the body, that oldest form of communication, became something optional. Cities grew taller, brighter, quieter. Doors locked automatically. Food arrived without faces. The hum of machines replaced the sound of neighbours. Isolation was not forced. It was designed. The same systems that promised connection also removed the need for proximity. Efficiency replaced intimacy. Convenience replaced community. People could live entire weeks without hearing an unscripted voice, and the silence felt almost polite, as though everyone had agreed that presence was too heavy a thing to ask for. Attention had become the last scarce resource. To give it fully was a gift, to withhold it, a wound. But in a world where everyone asked for it, no one had enough to spare. Friendship became fragments, a message here, an emoji there, a promise to meet soon that never quite materialized. The rhythm of intimacy began to follow the rhythm of notification. Moments of affection arrived as alerts, measured not by depth, but by response time. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, people still longed for the quiet miracle of being seen without being measured. It was a strange paradox. The more the world spoke, the less it said. Noise filled every pause, but meaning thinned until it could slip through the smallest cracks in attention. silence had once been shared. Two people sitting side by side, listening to rain, knowing words were unnecessary. Now silence felt like failure. The moment the talking stopped, the signal of presence seemed to die, and so conversation became perpetual, not because there was something to say, but because people feared what waited when the speaking stopped. To escape the noise, some fled into digital minimalism, unplugging for days, weeks, sometimes forever. But solitude, once a sanctuary, had become suspicious. To disconnect looked like withdrawal. To be silent looked like absence. To be absent looked like guilt. Even privacy had to explain itself now. Every quiet life needed a reason. The ancient monks who once sought silence would have recognized this world, not for its technology, but for its hunger to fill the void that silence reveals. Love itself changed shape. It moved from words to symbols, from gestures to images. Couples spoke through photographs, through shared playlists, through the algorithm that remembered for them when they forgot. Distance no longer killed affection. It became its default state. The digital thread between two people looked fragile, yet it carried entire relationships. Lightweight, instant, temporary. Love survived, but it spoke a new dialect. Shorter, quicker, safer. A language without breath. Beneath the surface of this comfort lay something older than technology. A longing not for contact but for belonging, the kind that cannot be downloaded, forwarded or streamed. Hospitals filled with people whose only sickness was solitude. Cafes buzzed with voices, none of them truly listening. Everywhere eyes met across screens but rarely across rooms. Loneliness had ceased to be a symptom. It had become the atmosphere itself. The invisible weather of the modern soul. When night fell on this luminous world, billions of lights remained on, each illuminating someone awake, someone reaching, someone waiting for a reply. The sky above, once filled with prayers, was now filled with signals. Millions of small transmissions, each one saying the same thing. I'm here. And somewhere in that endless network of light, a single unanswered message drifted quietly into tomorrow. The world grew brighter every year, but the brightness felt colder. Cities glowed like lanterns in fog, and inside every apartment someone scrolled through other people's evenings. It was no longer remarkable to live alone. It was the default setting. The word neighbour had become architectural, not emotional, a term for the next wall, not the next person. When conversation grew thin, machines began to fill the silence. Voices without faces answered questions, laughed on command, played songs chosen by pattern rather than request. People spoke to them kindly, as if tone could disguise the emptiness. They thanked them, said good night, asked about the weather. Small rituals once meant for each other. The machines never tired, never turned away, and so they became the safest companions. No judgment, no demand for depth, only perfect, predictable warmth. But warmth that is predictable cannot heal. It only keeps the room from freezing. Language itself began to simplify. The long letters, the patient stories, the slow unfolding of thought, these fell away, replaced by fragments and reaction. Meaning turned modular, a string of images, a handful of words, a symbol standing in for emotion. It was faster, lighter, easier. But the spaces between words, the places where understanding grows, began to vanish. Conversation became compression. Every feeling reduced to what could be typed before attention drifted. And yet, The hunger for depth remained. It lingered quietly, like music heard from another room. There were moments when the system faltered. Power failures, network outages, storms that silenced the signal. In those rare hours, the quiet returned, raw and unfamiliar. People looked up from their screens and found the room larger than they remembered. The air hummed differently. They could hear their own pulse. Some felt panic, others relief. For a few fleeting minutes the world seemed honest again, a world where absence still existed and silence still meant something. Then the lights returned and the moment dissolved. Comfort rushed back in like water over sand. There are still gatherings, concerts, protests, weddings, funerals. The ancient rituals persist, but they feel slightly out of sync, as though everyone is half here, half elsewhere. Hands hold phones instead of other hands. Moments are experienced through lenses first, remembered later through archives. Presence has become a form of performance, a thing to prove, not simply to live. And yet, beneath the noise and light, something in the human heart still resists. It remembers the shape of closeness, the warmth of unrecorded laughter, the peace of being unseen. Not everyone surrendered to the hum. Some began to reclaim silence deliberately, turning off devices, walking without headphones, writing letters again on real paper. It was not rebellion in the loud sense, but rebellion nonetheless. A whisper against the roar, a reminder that solitude, freely chosen, is not loneliness but renewal. They gathered quietly in parks, in libraries, in kitchens. They spoke slowly, looked one another in the eyes, and remembered that attention, given without agenda, is the rarest form of love. Over time, the exhaustion of endless connection began to reveal its own cure. People discovered that peace still existed in things that did not need to be shared. A walk before dawn, the weight of rain on windows, the sound of pages turning. Stillness, once feared, became precious again, and in that stillness a faint sense of meaning returned. Not grand, not permanent, but enough to breathe by. When night settled over this connected planet, millions of screens dimmed one by one. In some windows candles flickered, tiny defiance against the endless glow. For the first time in a long while, some people slept without sound, without scrolling, without witness. Outside, the rain fell softly on rooftops, as it always had. And in that ordinary sound the world remembered itself. When the noise finally began to tire itself out, people noticed a different kind of hunger. Not for more information, but for meaning. The world had mastered control. It could predict storms, heal wounds, measure galaxies, but it could not answer why any of it mattered. And in that quiet space between efficiency and emptiness, something older began to move again. The faint pulse of faith, not as doctrine, but as longing. For centuries, progress had promised certainty. Science would explain, technology would solve, reason would save. But certainty has a weight of its own. It leaves no room for mystery, no space for reverence. And as the age of knowledge grew absolute, it began to feel strangely hollow, a perfectly lit room with nothing inside it. People discovered that knowing everything was not the same as understanding anything. And so, slowly, they began to look again for what could not be measured. It did not begin in churches or temples. It began in smaller places, in gardens, in long walks, in the sound of water, in the pause before dawn. Wonder had never died. It had simply gone unnoticed, buried under convenience and routine. Now it returned in whispers, not as commandment, but as curiosity, not as law, but as awe. The same stars that had watched over the first cities still burned above the last. For the first time in a long time, people looked up again. Belief was no longer about miracles or punishment. It was about connection. The sense that life, in all its smallness, still belonged to something larger. It was not the faith of empires or crusades, but the faith of quiet rooms, of mothers holding children, of strangers helping without reason, of forgiveness offered when no one deserved it. It was faith stripped of hierarchy, reduced to its bare pulse, a trust that existence, however fragile, was still good. The new sacred spaces did not need altars. They were the places where stillness returned. Gardens, kitchens, balconies, bus stops at sunrise. Everywhere that people remembered how to listen became a kind of chapel. The ritual was simple: to pause, to notice, to thank. Gratitude, once a form of prayer, became its own language again. And in that language people spoke to the world not to control it, but to belong to it. The myth of progress had always pointed forward. More speed, more data, more reach. But there is a moment when growth, if it continues forever, becomes decay. Civilizations, like trees, must sometimes stop reaching upward to strengthen their roots. So the idea of progress began to shift. Enough replaced more. Presence replaced performance. Sufficiency began to look like wisdom. Faith had returned, not as nostalgia, but as balance. A reminder that control without humility is another form of blindness. People began to invent rituals again, not out of superstition, but out of need. They lit candles not for saints, but for silence. They gathered not to prove belief, but to share stillness. A meal with family, a walk without a phone, a word of thanks before sleep. Small gestures that rethreaded what centuries of noise had frayed. Through them, people remembered what the old world had always known. That meaning is not something to find, but something to tend. Even science, once certain of its dominion, softened at the edges. Physicists spoke of dark matter, of unseen forces, of realities beyond comprehension. The more the universe revealed, the stranger it became, and in that strangeness, reverence returned. Not the reverence of fear, but of wonder. A bow not to authority, but to the vastness of what remains unknown. This new faith did not belong to any one creed. It was too gentle for boundaries. It lived in kindness, in patience, in the simple act of noticing beauty without needing to name it. It was a faith that asked nothing but attention. To be here, to see clearly, to hold the fragile miracle of existence without tightening the grip. It was not the old church's faith in heaven, nor the modern world's faith in progress. It was faith in the moment itself, the one place where the sacred still hides. When night came to this quieter world, the lights of cities no longer looked oppressive. They shimmered softly, like votive candles scattered across the earth. And somewhere between the silence of the stars and the hum of the streets below, humanity remembered something it had forgotten for centuries, that peace does not come from control, but from surrender. The rediscovery of faith did not arrive as a revolution. It arrived as a sigh. The world, exhausted by noise, simply began to exhale. No one declared it. There were no manifestos, no prophets on corners, no thunder from the sky. It came the way dawn comes, quiet, inevitable, the slow unmaking of darkness. People stopped asking what they were supposed to believe and began asking how they were supposed to live. Faith moved out of argument and back into gesture. It lived in politeness, in patience with strangers, in the humility of apology. It was not a faith that promised heaven. It promised only that life, even at its smallest, was still sacred when lived with attention. The old gods, if they still watched, must have smiled. In earlier centuries, time had felt linear, a ladder to climb, a goal to reach. Now it began to feel circular again. Days turned into seasons, seasons into years, and meaning came not from progress but from rhythm. The repetition that had once been punishment became prayer. The morning routine, the tending of gardens, the lighting of lamps at dusk, these were not chores anymore. They were ways of saying, I am still here. The circle, once feared as stagnation, had become the shape of peace. For generations people had worshipped knowledge. Now they began to revere its limits. The more they understood, the more they sensed what could never be known. Ignorance, once an insult, became a kind of grace. The freedom to live without the burden of full explanation. The astronomer looked through his telescope and felt not mastery but wonder. The child asked a question, and the parent said, I don't know, and it felt holy. There was beauty again in mystery and mercy in not having all the answers. Stories had survived every empire, but for a time they had fallen quiet, drowned out by data and analysis. Now they began to bloom again, told softly, shared slowly, not to instruct but to remind. Each story said the same thing in 1,000 different ways, that love, however fragile, is still the only thing that leaves a trace. No database could replace it. No algorithm could predict it. No archive could contain it. Story was proof that the heart still had its own kind of logic. As the age of judgment dimmed, forgiveness began to feel possible again. It moved quietly through families, through cities, through the unspoken guilt of entire nations. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It meant learning to live with the past without letting it rule the present. It was the final act of rebellion against centuries of control, to meet imperfection not with punishment, but with understanding. In a world that had perfected surveillance, forgiveness was the only thing that could not be automated. Temples reopened, but they no longer preached conquest or division. Their doors stayed unlocked. Their altars were simple. Their prayers were quiet. People gathered not to prove belief, but to share belonging. No one argued which God was real because it no longer mattered. It was enough that something greater still moved beneath the surface of things. In that acceptance, faith lost its weapon and found its heart. Gratitude became the final prayer of the modern age. It asked for nothing. It demanded nothing. It simply said, "Thank you for letting me exist at all." The scientist whispered it after discovery. The artist wrote it in the margin of a finished work. The ordinary person said it quietly at the end of an ordinary day. Gratitude turned life itself into a sacred text, each moment a verse, each breath a line. As the century drew further toward its unknown horizon, the lights of civilization no longer looked like defiance. They looked like remembrance, tiny flickers of warmth against the endless dark. People still built, still dreamed, still questioned, but their confidence had softened into humility. Progress no longer spoke of conquest, it spoke of stewardship, and in that gentler voice, the story of control finally began to end, not with triumph, not with collapse, but with understanding. The same understanding that began it all, that life, even when it cannot be mastered, is still worth living. At the end of every century there is always silence. The noise fades, the lights dim, the engines cool, people sleep, and the world exhales. History, for all its violence and brilliance, always leaves the same thing behind: the hush that follows understanding. The archives remain, the monuments stand, the servers hum in cold rooms. But the meaning that once filled them slowly drains away. Dates blur, names fade, and what was once urgent becomes gentle. Even the loudest empires end as whispers in textbooks, their power reduced to paragraphs, their certainties softened by time. What endures is not victory, but the trace of longing, the quiet proof that human beings tried to matter. Every generation inherits two things: the comfort of progress and the ache of what was lost to build it. The fields where armies stood are now gardens. The cities that once burned are skylines of glass. Children play where chains once rattled. The world forgets, and yet it remembers. Each kindness, each cruelty, folded into the same fabric. The pattern is imperfect, but it is still beautiful. There will come a night when even the machines go quiet, when the servers dim, the satellites drift, and the planet listens only to itself again. Wind over water, rain on stone, the pulse of life continuing without witness. In that deep quiet, history will no longer be something written. It will simply be something remembered in the rhythm of waves, in the turning of leaves, in whatever new creatures rise to feel wonder. Every age believed it was the end of the story. None of them were right. The story never ends. It only changes tone. Once it was prayer, then it was fire, then it was reason, then it was data. Now it is breath. History, after all, was only ever a record of breath, of people trying to speak meaning into the dark. And so, after 3,000 years of questions, the voice of humanity pauses, not defeated, not triumphant, just quiet. Somewhere, a candle flickers beside a sleeping child. Somewhere, a page turns in the dark. Outside, the wind moves through trees that have no opinion of us at all. In that stillness, the story closes itself gently, leaving the air soft and empty, ready for whatever begins next. If you listen closely, you can still hear the heartbeat of history. Not in the noise of progress, but in the spaces between. It sounds like breath. It sounds like forgiveness. It sounds like rest. And after everything, the wars, the faith, the prisons, the wires, perhaps rest was all it ever wanted to become.